All right, wonderful. So we'll begin our meeting today, or the second half of our EQC meeting at 9:07 this morning. And with everybody's permission, though, there's one thing that I might like to add, at least a very, very brief discussion of, unless, Director, you were thinking of mentioning it as part of your report. Recently, the EQC filled out its annual self-evaluation survey. And I wanted to thank all the commissioners who obviously put some real time and thought into that, because we got a lot of really good feedback. And while we have a very full agenda for today, I think there's some things in here that we are going to want to talk about together and ways in which we can improve our work together. And so just wanted to give that some time and space. And in fact, maybe identify either a future agenda item or even a sidebar agenda item for any commissioners who might be interested in exploring some of these ideas a little bit further. Director.
Yes, thank you, Chair George. For the record, Richard Whitman, DEQ Director. Thanks for that, and thanks everybody for filling out the surveys and putting some time and thought into it. I have to admit, I have not seen the results yet. So I look forward to seeing those and reading those and discussing them with the Commission. I maybe because of that suggest that we set this, we have a standing agenda item for Commission business, and we could have this discussion at the November Commission meeting. Is that timely enough, Chair George, to address?
It is. It definitely is. And I think that's the right approach. In fact, we can, there's definitely some groups of ideas, which it won't surprise anyone. It could be that we might talk about clarifying a few of those a little bit further and sharing those with Stephanie, who could send out for requests for further detail. One of them, and again, I'll just mention this briefly and then we'll move on with our day, but actually has directly to do with something that Commissioner Brasso and Richard, we've all been discussing recently, which is ways in which to have more dialogue and interaction during our public comment period. I think we've all been feeling the same thing. On the one hand, it's great to be a listening body, but on the other hand, there's a real desire for the public to know that we want to interact with the ideas that they're sharing. I think there are ways that we can try to do that more. So let's do that. Let's reserve some time on an upcoming agenda. And commissioners, it may be that we'll work with Stephanie to get even a little bit more feedback and define some of these ideas, or solicit some of your suggestions, if that sounds good to everybody. Thumbs up, thumbs down, okay. Great. Great. Thanks very much, everyone, for that indulgence. All right, let's get underway with the director's report.
Okay, thank you, Chair George. And again, good morning, commissioners and folks who are listening in today. I am, the next hour or so, going to give the director's report. There is a written director's report that you have in your materials, but there's a lot going on right now. And so I'm actually going to cover a number of items that are not in the written director's report that are important for updating the Commission. And those include an update on the wildfire situation and smoke and response, an update on Columbia Pacific biorefinery action that the department just took, an update on something going on at the federal level in terms of a federal rollback that is starting to have some fairly significant effects in Oregon under the Clean Water Act. And then at the end here, is indicated in the written report, there's also been a lot going on in terms of work on diversity, equity, and inclusion and racial justice at DEQ. And Eric Feely, who is the president of AFSCME Local, the union for the agency, has asked for some time to talk to the Commission, and I've invited him to come and talk as part of the director's report. So you can hear some perspective from the union directly on this. And so at the end of the director's report, I'll do that. But I'm going to start out talking about wildfire and response and recovery to wildfire. So up on your screens, you can see the latest air quality index for PM 2.5, which translates essentially into smoke, wildfire smoke, at least right now, and what we're seeing around Oregon. Things have improved fairly significantly, but we still have some significant smoke, areas of smoke down in the Cave Junction area, in and around Bend, and still to some degree up in the Portland metro area, where the weather that we had come into the state last night hasn't completely cleared things out. But things are getting better. They're forecasted to get better here over the next few days. Obviously, we're still in a period of significant wildfire risk for spread of existing fires or new fire starts, and that's going to be the case for a little while here. But just responding to the wildfires that have occurred over the last couple of weeks, we have more than 2,000 residences that have been destroyed in the state with more damaged, and at least 1,400 other structures around the state that were destroyed. So obviously our hearts go out to folks who have suffered great loss during this period, and both we've had loss of life as well as loss of property, and we've had a significant number of people evacuated and living in difficult living situations. Governor Brown several days ago convened a disaster cabinet. This is an emergency response structure using the incident command structure that we've been practicing in Oregon for several years now, and have was stood up to also help with the COVID pandemic response, but most recently has been stood up specifically for responding to the wildfires and then recovery from the wildfires. DEQ has just joined the disaster cabinet, along with partner agencies including ODOT, Oregon Emergency Management Health Authority, our Regional Solutions Program, and many others. So what is DEQ's role in this? We have several roles. Our primary role here under the state's disaster response plan is, at least for this type of disaster, is debris, handling debris and debris removal. And we, I don't want to underestimate the amount of work that is going to be out there involving debris removal. We've seen in California that has obviously had a lot of experience in this the last several years. Debris removal is a significant issue, and there are issues around household hazardous waste. A lot of that is asbestos, but potentially other hazards that can be present in ash at sites of homes that have been destroyed or damaged. And then even where we're not dealing with the hazardous waste, just dealing with the sheer volume of waste and getting it removed and safely managed is a significant issue. It's a regulatory issue. We have our solid waste program that applies. And in past incidents like this, we have done rule waivers. So we are currently looking at under the governor's emergency authority, potential rule waivers around dealing with solid waste and asbestos. We cannot waive federal law. So if we do waive any requirements, it'll be state law requirements that are in our rules. So we're in the middle of working through that right now with the governor's office and other partners. And then another big aspect of it, so public health in terms of hazardous waste, operational, just managing the solid waste, working with ODOT, counties, private contractors for where trees and highway debris and building debris, where does it all go and how does it get safely disposed of? So working operationally with ODOT and OEM and other, that's Office of Emergency Management and others on that. And then finally, financial issues. So managing all that solid waste is expensive. The information from California is cost of debris removal for a home that has been destroyed can run on the order of $100,000 potentially. So that's a significant cost for homeowners that are already in difficult circumstances. There are insurance issues in terms of what is and is not covered by insurance. And then there are federal funding issues. FEMA is participating as a co-lead on the disaster recovery in Oregon, along with the Office of Emergency Management. FEMA made a major disaster declaration for the state. We need additional action by FEMA to potentially bring in federal funding for debris removal. And we're working with Office of Emergency Management and FEMA on that right now. Even if FEMA funding becomes available for debris removal, there is still a non-federal 25% cost share. And so we're working the financial side of this also, along again with partner state agencies and counties and local governments to try to identify how all this gets paid for. So that's debris removal. A lot of moving parts. We have set up an incident command structure within DEQ to coordinate this work. Also, Brian Bowling is leading that effort. Leah Felden is closely involved also. There is also we believe there is going to be a water quality task force set up as part of this also. There are issues around drinking water quality impacts from the wildfires. There also are impacts to on-site septic systems that can be damaged or destroyed as a result of fire. And then in some of these communities, there are small wastewater treatment plant operations that may have been damaged or destroyed as part of this. So again, same types of issues around immediate response, getting people fresh water for drinking, medium-term response in terms of sanitation, and then long-term response and recovery around functionally fixing, replacing, repairing systems to put these communities back together. So a lot of work there, and this is not just state. FEMA, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers are heavily involved. We appreciate the federal assistance, county governments, some local government, other local governments also heavily involved in this. So this will be a major focus for the agency here in the coming now and in the coming weeks, particularly as we head into a rainy season. That will make this harder. It'll help with the wildfires, but it's going to start raising more issues with both debris management and water quality. So that's a really quick snapshot of what's going on with wildfire response. Kind of an all hands on deck situation here. Any questions from the commission?
Commissioner Addington.
Richard, so how often does this group meet, and like what's the directive? I mean, is it just to, make things work as best we can? Are you going to be looking at strategies to, fast track things?
No. So Greg, again, in terms of the structure for managing this, We have the Emergency Coordination Center, the ECC, which is our normal emergency response system, is operating and handling immediate coordination on this. But then is an overlay on top of that for getting high-level decisions made quickly in a coordinated fashion. That's the governor's disaster cabinet, and that is meeting every day for the foreseeable future. And either I or Leah Feldon are participating for DEQ in that, along with about 15 other state agencies and the governor's office. That's also, there's a communications function, both with the Emergency Coordination Center, and then with Disaster Cabinet, we've got a communications coordination also. There's also a legislative coordination aspect of this. We've got interim legislative session next week, and there are going to be probably multiple funding requests going to the emergency board for funding to do some of this work. So it's a coordinated incident command structure for responding to the wildfires, federal, state, and local, is the short answer.
I suspect, I mean, I don't want to get in the way of anything. I just wondered if there was an opportunity or a mechanism for the public or local officials to provide input to that group. And the reason I say that is, we've already heard in Southern Oregon from people with connections to places like Paradise, California, about what worked well and what didn't work well. And I just wonder if there's some lessons to learn there, and talking to some, I mean, I know some local people here are going to be reaching out to those officials. And so it might just be good to be able to have some way to have some input.
Yeah, so with FEMA, FEMA obviously had a lot of experience with Paradise. I know our Office of Emergency Management and other state entities have reached out to California on their experience with Paradise. We're talking about those lessons learned.
Great.
And in the ECC, Emergency Coordination system for the state, there is a plug-in for county and other local government entities to be in that part of that system. Great. So kind of yes to all of the above.
Right, thank you.
Yep. I will emphasize we probably are going to be doing some rule waivers. I will be, so that will be the governor most likely issuing a supplemental executive order, and then an order from me carrying out that executive order more specifically. That's the way we've handled it. In the past, we had the Canyon Creek fire over in Eastern Oregon, and then we had the big fires down in Douglas County down in 2015. So we're following some of those models in our response here. Okay. Now I'm going to completely switch gears. And there are two, as I understand it, action items that we need from the commission that are kind of just taking care of, actually, I think only one of them is an action item. I'm sorry about that. So in the written director's report, we have a rulemaking authority delegation that has been to Meyer Goldstein, our longtime rules coordinator at DEQ, who recently retired after many years working for the state of great service. And Emil Hinley is going to be moving into carrying out those duties on an agency-wide basis, on an interim basis here. So there is an attachment to the director's report, attachment A, and Chair George, I think I just need a simple vote action of the commission approving appointing Emil Hindley as the interim rules coordinator for the agency, consistent with attachment A to the director's report. And
Okay.
Stephanie, if that does not work, you should raise your hand. Okay. So I would ask the, Chair George, I would ask the commission for a verbal action approval of attachment A to the director's report.
All right, commissioners, I will entertain a motion to approve the appointment of Emil Hindley as described in attachment A of the director's report as the interim rules coordinator.
So this is Commissioner Kyle for the record. I move that we accept attachment A to the director's report.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Thank you. We have motion first and second. Directors, do we have any, commissioners, do we have further question or discussion on this matter? All right, hearing none. Those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed signify same sign. Any abstentions? Hearing none, the motion carries. Thank you, Director.
Thank you, Chair George. Okay, I want to go back now to some degree the written director's report and just give a verbal update on some late breaking actions around the Columbia Pacific Biorefinery facility. This is the facility out in Clatskanie that we recently issued a renewal and modification for the air contaminant discharge permits. This is a facility that both transloads, has transloaded fossil fuels for shipment from rail onto barges, and also has processed and shipped ethanol fuel as well. And so that was the permit modification and renewal. We had a petition for reconsideration from, if I remember correctly, Columbia River Keepers and others. And also Neighbors for Clean Air, that asked for reconsideration of those permit actions. Part of the basis for the reconsideration was evidence that they presented that the permittee no longer has a contractual right to utilize some major storage tanks that are adjacent to the Columbia Pacific facility that are owned and operated by Portland General. And after looking at that evidence, we made the decision to grant in part the request for reconsideration. And that does not mean that we've made a final decision on this, but we are going to reconsider it, look at the evidence that's been presented, and issue a new decision on that permit renewal and modification. So I know this is something that the commission's talked about before and had questions about, so I wanted to make you aware of that action. Any questions about that? Okay.
Just maybe procedure-wise, Director, so we understand that the department is taking a look at that under the request for reconsideration. Will that just proceed and a decision be made, or is there anything further that we would hear about that process review before the decision is revisited?
So Chair George, the decision will be revisited by the department, and I will report on the decision to the commission when we make the decision. I can't tell you exactly how long that's going to be at this point. but I assume it's going to it's going to be, you know, a month or two at the earliest before we work through that.
Okay, understood. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I apologize. I'm bouncing around here a little bit, but I see Deputy Director Leah Feldman's back. So I want to briefly talk about strategic planning. We talked about this in connection with the State of the Environment report that I presented yesterday, but I don't have any visual presentation for this. But again, we are starting the strategic planning process. There will be requests from our contractor, which is a consulting firm called Barry Dunn. So you will be hearing, I believe, individually, possibly as a small group, from Barry Dunn wanting to sit down and talk with you about the strategic plan and about the agency and about the future of the agency. Once the so-called environmental scan phase of this project is done, the next phase of the work is the so-called visioning phase. You know, the long-term future vision for the agency. And at that point, I am anticipating coming to the commission as part of that visioning process and having some time on your agenda to talk about that with you as a group. That probably will be at either the January or March EQC meeting. There may be, we also have a steering committee within the agency that is being set up to work with the consultant on the strategic plan. That steering committee will include a number of members from DEQ's leadership team, a number of DEQ managers, and a number of DEQ line staff. And we're working to really get a diversity of perspectives for that steering committee. And then we also are anticipating that we will have a forum for more of a group conversation with some of our external partners in interest about the strategic plan as well, to provide input. And again, that work probably is part of the visioning stage, will probably be January, March. I should have started this by saying also that Leah Feldman, our Deputy Director, is going to be the executive sponsor for this effort. And I will be on the steering committee and active in it, but this is a great opportunity for Leah to really put her stamp on it and her thoughts into it as well. And so I want to pause for a moment and see, Leah, do you want to add anything to what I just said?
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, I was just looking at the timeline in case anybody has questions on that, but the whole process is projected to take about a year, just to give you some sense of timing. And I think we flashed a slide at you yesterday that had the project timeline, but it might have been a little small to see. So the goal would be that we have a plan for implementation and monitoring plans about a year from now. So maybe end of September 2021. And I think I would just add briefly that there's a lot going on right now. There's so many things that DEQ had planned and things we certainly did not have planned, right? So, and I know the commission is well aware of all of those things. And so I just want to assure you that there's been a lot of thought put into whether to do this at this time and to think about the bandwidth of the agency and the ability to take this on, and with many discussions with our leadership team and with the consultant, we decided it was still that important to do for the agency, that we owe a strategic plan to the agency so that they have a roadmap to see where we're going, and so that leadership has a roadmap to help make important resource decisions. And perhaps in times like COVID and wildfire response and important projects like EDMS, having that roadmap maybe is more important than ever. So I just wanted to mention that. Thank you.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Lee.
I appreciate that. And I want to take just a moment to commend you, Richard, and Leah both. You had some conversations with members of the commission about whether or not now is the right time to proceed with the strategic planning initiative for the reasons Leah laid out. We're really seeing some unprecedented challenges to the state, and both in terms of workload and budget, there's going to be some very serious consequences. But I want to commend you for having the vision to do what I really do think is the right decision. When done well, a strategic plan will lay out for leadership what the priorities, need to be. And in difficult times, even in times of resources being cut, that plan should lay out to you and the public and be available to anyone to show the way as to what the priorities are and to help support why certain decisions are being made. So it's really more important in challenging times than probably any other time. So I want to commend the department for continuing because it really can be that very clear communication tool to the public as to why DEQ's priorities are what they are. So well done. We'll look forward to hearing a lot more about that, I know.
Thanks, Chair George. Sorry, this is a little disjointed this morning because as Leah just said, there's a lot going on. So budget. I'm going to give just a quick mention of budget. We are on the verge of submitting our agency request budget as part of the annual or biennial budget cycle with the legislature. We have received instructions around reductions and planning for reductions. We always do planning for a 10% budget reduction, and we've done that this time around, but I would say it's more serious this time around than in past budget cycles, at least going back to the Great Recession. There's still a whole lot of uncertainty about what the budget will look like starting next July for the 21-23 period. The next step in the process will be the governor's recommended budget, which will come out in late November, early December, and will be involved with the governor's office as she makes decisions about what to prioritize. And then obviously the final decision making will be by the legislature in March, April, May, June of next year. There is a revenue forecast that will be coming out next week from the state that will be important for what the governor puts in her budget. And we're all waiting for that, but without that revenue forecast, I really don't have a lot more to report to the commission right now. We will provide an update in November and again in January as we move forward on the process. Okay, let me just pause and see if there are any immediate questions on budget. Okay, so the next, I have two quick things I want to cover, and then I want to, again, provide some time for Eric Feely to talk about DEI. So it's going to be quick. The first is on diesel. I know that there are at least a couple, if not more, commissioners who really would like to hear more from the agency, big picture, about what are we doing on diesel and what are the plans on diesel. And we actually do have a few slides for the commission on this, but I'm going to kind of call an audible here and suggest that we do that at the November meeting rather than today. We'd be happy to talk with, if an individual commissioner has questions and wants to talk with us about big picture on diesel, we'd be happy to do that. We are looking at a collection of actions on diesel, and it can be hard to see the forest for the trees on diesel at times, because there are so many pieces to the puzzle of what actions we're looking at taking or are already taking on diesel reduction. So I'm not trying to avoid this issue, but just recognizing the time today and kind of the number of things going on. If that's okay with the commission, we'll make sure that we have a good structured time for this conversation at the November EQC meeting.
I think that sounds very good and appreciate that personally. I do know we have a very full agenda today. And I think you're right, Richard, there are a lot of pieces in movement. There's a lot of different pieces to the work that DEQ is doing on this front. I just want to make sure the commission said when we had the rule petition, and at that time, the commission did not feel that that was a step that they could take. But we did make the commitment that this was going to remain a high priority for the commission and for the department. And we know work is ongoing. But as you've said, I think, at least for me personally, it's a little hard for me to know where all those pieces are and when they're going to come together into some discrete products that the commission can use to kind of do some gap analysis. So I think an agenda item for the next meeting sounds right to me. Commissioners, does that work for you? Okay, great. I'm seeing nodding heads. So let's plan for that. Thank you, Director.
I'm going to just say for the record, the department understands this is important to the commission, and that the commission, we understand the commission has a high level of interest in this work and in taking further steps on reducing diesel emissions in Oregon. So look forward to the November meeting and talk about specifics about how to carry that out.
That sounds good. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Then very quickly, one last issue before we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. The federal EPA rulemaking on waters of the U.S. Or WOTUS, as it's people are coming to call it, and relatedly on Section 401 of the Federal Clean Water Act, which has to do with state authority, reserve state authority to put conditions on federal permits and licenses for activities that affect state waters. We are starting to see significant changes in how the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers regulates projects involving wetlands and isolated waters, particularly closed basins in the southeast portion of the state. And so projects, including some significant projects that in the past would have required federal review and state review under Section 401, are no longer being reviewed by the Corps. And we are working with the regulated community on these projects, because the state still has laws on the books concerning water quality impacts of those types of activities. So we are we have a bridge approach on this that we are instituting right now, entering into agreements with projects like this to assure that we're protecting water quality under state law. This almost certainly is going to require some policy work by the commission and some rulemaking by the state as we go forward. And we're evaluating that right now and working with staff at DEQ, but also staff at other agencies, including particularly the Department of State Lands, which runs the state wetland program, but also other agencies, including Oregon Fish and Wildlife, in terms of looking out for protection of resources. So more to come on this. I appreciate all the work that staff are doing to make sure that state resources are being protected, even though the federal government is backing away from some of these projects. And again, we'll provide a more detailed report to the commission probably at the November EQC meeting, but just be aware there's a lot going on there right now. Okay, so with that, I'll pause and see if there are any questions there. Okay.
Doesn't look like it.
Thanks, Chair George. So with that, let me just do a check here and see. Eric Feely, are you on and ready to go?
Yes, I am, Director.
Great, welcome. So again, let me just do a quick introduction for you, Eric. Eric Feely is the head of our FSME local, and we work quite closely together. I have worked closely, particularly around COVID issues here over the past number of months, and appreciate the working relationship between leadership at DEQ and AFSCME. And I know the union has also been thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, has passed a resolution on the subject. And so this is a great opportunity for Eric to come and talk to the commission about that resolution and the work that the union is doing. Thanks, Eric.
Thank you, Director Whitman. And good morning, Chair George, Vice Chair Barrasso, and members of the commission. For the record, my name is Eric Feely. And while I have come before this commission previously as an air quality planner for DEQ, I sit before you today in my role as President of American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees Local 3336. Our AFSCME local represents about 570 employees that work for the department. We are workers from dozens of different job classifications, spending each day implementing Oregon's environmental regulations. My purpose for being here today is to make you aware of a recent resolution that our membership passed regarding racial justice at DEQ. Our local union formed over 30 years ago, in part because we wanted management to take employee concerns more seriously. And periodically, we come before this body to share those concerns. But first, I wanted to let you know that our union works through several channels to bring about culture change at DEQ. Our Joint Labor Management Committee is one forum where we have had conversations with Director Whitman over the years about his diversity vision. In fact, on multiple occasions, the director has made it clear to that committee that it should contribute strategic ideas on how the agency could increase diversity. Labor, in turn, brought ideas forward and even brought in a local expert on the subject in order to inspire change and action by management. These were ideas that had proven effective at other government agencies in Oregon and beyond. We also enter into contract negotiations every 2 years with the agency, along with the Department of Administrative Services. During recent rounds of negotiations, we have proposed ideas like changes to agency hiring practices to improve diversity, establishing employee resource groups to help support employees, and having the agency consult with our union in the production of the agency's affirmative action report. Whether or not the agency ultimately ended up accepting the ideas that we proposed, I am here to tell you that the conversations on some of these topics left labor representatives feeling a little frustrated. Of course, like all unions, we continue to use the complaints and grievance arbitration processes to address issues that arise related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have also used collective action to make it clear to agency leadership that a particular decision they were about to make regarding equity was simply wrong. At this point, I would like to acknowledge some of the work the agency has accomplished related to diversity. In the fall of 2018, the agency created a Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. The agency encourages staff to attend equity conferences, The agency agreed with our union to improve hiring practices, which include having more diverse hiring panels. And in addition, you can find a series of accomplishments listed in the agency's affirmative action plan and regular reports sent to the Environmental Justice Task Force. More recently, this past August, Director Whitman sent out a communication to all staff sharing his DEI vision. He mentioned that DEQ staff and the EQC would be able to provide input on that vision over the coming year. Our local union welcomes an opportunity to contribute to that process. However, our membership is much more focused right now on specific actions that should be taken to start to bridge the large gap between where the agency is and where it needs to be. I'd like to now read directly from our local's resolution, which is attachment F in the director's report. It is entitled Addressing Racial Injustice at DEQ. Whereas Black Lives Matter, and whereas racism is an environmental health issue, communities of color are disproportionately exposed to environmental contaminants such as pesticides, lead, nitrogen dioxide, as well as hazards such as drinking water violations and living near hazardous waste facilities. Whereas Black people in America are 79% more likely than whites to live in neighborhoods where industrial pollution is suspected of posing the greatest risk to their health. Whereas the United States environmental laws, regulations, and policies are not applied uniformly, resulting in communities of color being exposed to elevated health risks. Whereas DEQ historically has not and currently does not allocate meaningful financial or staff resources to advancing equity and dismantling institutional racism within the agency. Whereas DEQ does not have a racial equity plan or policy, does not have a statement on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and has not conducted an internal racial equity audit. Whereas some Black DEQ employees have experienced racial discrimination at work. Whereas DEQ has historically and continues to be a white-led organization. Black, Indigenous, and people of color make up only 14% of DEQ's permanent employees, compared to 25% of the population statewide and 31% of the population in Multnomah County, where the majority of DEQ employees are located. Black employees make up just 1% of DEQ's workforce. Whereas implicit bias has been scientifically proven to influence hiring decisions and reduce workplace diversity in spite of the best intentions of hiring managers and equal employment law, with studies showing that typically Caucasian sounding names and male names receive significantly greater response rates than names associated with women and minorities. Whereas DEQ's policies and programs have direct and indirect impacts on community members, and status quo methods of gathering public input about how marginalized communities are affected by them are insufficient and do not center their experiences and knowledge. Whereas Black people in America face systemic oppression in the education system and other barriers to gaining the skills, qualifications, and education required for professional careers at the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. Therefore, be it resolved that AFSCME Local 3336 requests DEQ to 1, hire a full-time environmental justice coordinator position at DEQ with accompanying budget to conduct their work and meaningful decision-making authority to influence and guide policy at DEQ. This position could also include ongoing recommendations and evaluation of DEQ's impact on environmental justice communities, ongoing training with clear direction and conversations about environmental justice and DEQ's daily work. 2, provide paid time for staff to invest in education and outreach to BIPOC communities, including invest in environmental science educational programming, specifically for high school and college age BIPOC, to encourage them to consider DEQ technical careers. Reinstate and expand the historical mentorship program that connected high school students of color to DEQ employees. Participate in the Urban League of Portland's Workforce Development Program, Camp ELSO, and Groundwork Portland. Provide paid internships within each division, air, laboratory, land, and water, solely for Black, Indigenous, people of color, to ensure that BIPOC have opportunities for gaining experience without previous requirements. 3, conduct an audit of the agency's hiring, retention, and DEI practices using a qualified and independent third party that specifically includes recommendations on improving the respective practices. Develop a plan with a timeline for how the agency seeks to implement the recommendations and report out to agency staff the recommendations, plan, and progress. 4, require that all DEQ staff complete training and workshops on environmental justice, racial literacy, and sensitivity, microaggressions, and Oregon's racist history, in addition to the implicit bias training, with a third-party facilitator. We advocate for training at all management levels. Number 5, support more equitable and inclusive stakeholder engagement that reduces barriers to participation on advisory committees, including but not limited to compensation for meals, childcare, travel support, and stipends, translation, transcreation services, and virtual participation channels. 6, conduct a recruitment for a diversity, equity, and inclusion director at the agency, separate from human resources, with accompanying budget to conduct their work and with meaningful decision-making authority to influence and guide policy at DEQ. The recruitment process should involve represented members of the DEI committee. 7, advocate for the creation of an environmental justice citizen oversight committee to review and provide input into major DEQ decisions, audit DEQ protocols and processes, provide input for how our work can better protect the most vulnerable, and hold the agency accountable to their environmental justice goals. 8, support BIPOC staff at DEQ through employee resource groups, including paid time for attendance and training. 9, address all of these demands within 2 years of the adoption of this resolution or less, and agree that DEQ management meets quarterly with the local to provide status and progress updates on the above resolutions in a transparent manner. I thank you for the opportunity to share this resolution with you. We hope that the EQC will consider the content of this resolution when providing future input to the agency. And we look forward to future meetings with agency leadership to discuss our requests. I would also like to thank the Director Whitman for providing us time on the agenda for today.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you very much, Eric. Excuse me, interruption, Director. I just wanted to personally thank Eric for joining us today and for sharing the status of his work with the department and the resolution and taking the time to go through it with us. These matters are of the utmost importance, and your taking time to come and talk through them with us, I think is very important, and we very much appreciate it. And we will be following up with the Director. Director, I'm sorry, did you have more to say?
Thank you, Chair George. And I want to start out again by thanking Eric and the local and the leadership of the local. It's clear that a lot of work went into this resolution, a lot of thought. That really shows, and I really appreciate it. And we look forward to sitting down and talking through the specifics of the resolution and specific next steps. This is really important work for DEQ and for all government agencies. But DEQ really in particular is an agency that has responsibilities for protecting public health. It's important that both in terms of our internal dealings with each other, our diversity, equity, and inclusion work within the agency, that we work to make DEQ as an institution that is more reflective of the society and culture that's around us. So we're committed to that work. But it's also important, and we also have a responsibility in this work in terms of how we develop and implement policy. That's part of our responsibility as a state institution. And being aware of the historic burdens that have been placed on communities of color, indigenous communities, Black communities in Oregon, around Oregon over time is critical to understanding our responsibility going forward to both avoid making those burdens worse and to doing what we can to reverse that burden and provide policies and implement policies that benefit those communities over time. That's a lot of work. We're in the middle of really a second generation effort around environmental justice right now on the greenhouse gas reduction climate change work that we're doing. I'm very proud of how that's gone so far, but we have a really long way to go. But that work, and you're going to hear about it a little bit more in the next agenda item, we're really trying to center equity as we approach the work in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And both substantively in terms of policy and also just in terms of having those communities at the table as part of the decision-making process. So I really look forward to this work. It's way overdue. It can't happen soon enough. And it needs to be done with full commitment from the agency. We're gonna stumble at times. We're gonna make mistakes, but it is our responsibility to move this forward. And I'm committed to that. So thank you for bringing this forward.
Vice Chair Barrasso.
Thank you. Eric, I just want to appreciate and thank you for this as well. I know when I joined the commission, this continues to be an area of interest, but it's hard. It's really hard work. So I appreciate you all doing this. And we have a unique moment in having both leadership on EQC aligned with this, and I mean acknowledging that you've got two members of the commission that come from BIPOC communities, like it is, and seeing this from from AFSCME and knowing leadership's commitment. I really appreciate seeing this in this moment because it's hard to be able to do this. It's hard when you don't have folks collectively aligned and wanting to see this work move forward. So there is a unique moment. I think it's critical we take advantage of that. And I'm absolutely committed in doing that work. The one ask I would have of you all as part of AFSCME in this moment, and I recognize this particularly working within the city, having worked at the county in the past, is, and this is a challenge. I was on the leadership team for the environmental professionals of color for a few years, and so I feel like helped build that network from 100 or so folks to 300 plus folks, and I recognize sort of what that cohort looked like within at least the Portland area. And what I know is we have a lot of younger professionals of color that are coming into the space. I also know that as they come into government jobs, where they are represented by Fortune or unions, which are doing great work, the challenges as layoffs do come, they happen to be the first out. So that's something I know there's going to be a reckoning with right now across the city, across our collective, all the various places where we have represented workforce, and where seniority plays a huge role in terms of how layoffs happen. And so as we do the hard work to diversify our workforce, I really think it's important that our unions are there and thinking through how we make sure that those that we are bringing in to diversify our workforce aren't those that are let out. So that's my ask in doing that hard work, because right now that's going to come across us all very soon. So thank you.
Important points. Thank you for those. Well, once again, Eric, we just really want to sincerely thank you for bringing us into the conversation. We know that it's, we stand at the beginning, not the very beginning. We do know that there's been work, but that of a long process. But it couldn't be more important to the success of this agency and to its fulfilling its mission. Thank you and the union for your leadership in this matter. And we look forward to more conversations and to hearing how this work progresses as you work with the department and you work through the issues raised in the resolution. We know that there will be times where we will be a part of that conversation. So thank you again for joining us today, and we look forward to hearing from you again.
Thank you, Chair George, commissioners.
Take care. All right, Director Whitman, is that the conclusion of the director's report for today?
It is, Chair George. Thank you.
All right, very good. So 10:07, not too bad. We will now move forward with our Informational Greenhouse Gas Reduction Program Rules Advisory Committee update.
So thank you, Chair George. For the record, Richard Whitman, and I believe we've got Colin McConaughey here also to help with the presentation of this report.
Yes, we can see Colin. Colin, welcome.
Okay,
Good morning.
thanks. So let me set the context for this report, and then I'll turn it over to Colin. As you know, we are embarked on a very ambitious rulemaking effort here using existing authority that's been granted by the Oregon legislature to control emissions, including greenhouse gas emissions from sources. And under the governor's executive order, specifically to look at work to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in 3 sectors, and with large industrial stationary sources, with transportation fuels, and with natural gas and other fuels. We expect that rulemaking will commence in early 2021. So under the existing state law for rulemaking, the State Administrative Procedures Act, we have a structure that we have to follow in rulemaking. And that structure includes creation of a rules advisory committee for the commission to review the rules as they're developed and make recommendations to the commission, both on the rules and also on the fiscal impact of the rules. So the purpose of the presentation today is to present some initial thinking from the department about the Rules Advisory Committee and the structure, makeup, and function of the Rules Advisory Committee for you to give us some initial feedback on, and then bring this back to you for decision on membership of the Rules Advisory Committee at your November meeting. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Colin to run through the next part of the report. Colin?
Thank you, Director. If we can go to the next slide, and actually maybe just want to acknowledge here real quickly that what we're talking about here is the Rules Advisory Committee. Excuse me. Good morning, Chair George, commissioners. For the record, my name is Colin McConaughey. I manage the Office of Greenhouse Gas Programs at DEQ. Apologies for that delayed introduction. On this slide, we're just acknowledging that what we're talking about here is a Rules Advisory Committee specific to the development of the Cap and Reduce program that is one of several components of Governor Brown's executive order to DEQ. The other directives include expansion of our clean fuels program, directives to regulate methane at landfills, as well as reduce food waste. So this is today what we're talking about is a Rules Advisory Committee specific to the directive to cap and reduce greenhouse gas emissions from transportation fuels, from large stationary sources of greenhouse gases, as well as all other fossil fuels, including natural gas. So just want to note that that's what we're talking about here today. If we can go to the next slide, please. Great, thank you. So this slide shows at a very high level, the process that we've outlined for developing this greenhouse gas cap and reduce program or programs. And what you see here is that we're square in the middle of our scoping process, as we've called it, which is a phase before entering rulemaking. And actually just yesterday, we finished our 6th and final technical workshop. So you see it there in the scoping phase here for this summer and this fall. We had a public kickoff meeting earlier in the summer, and then we've held 6 technical workshops that have really focused on particular aspects of this program, such as the overall scope and which emissions should be covered and which entities should be covered by this program. What sorts of compliance flexibility should we allow in this program for regulated entities? Variety of different topics. And I have to say the turnout and the engagement that we've received thus far has been phenomenal. I really have to sound a note of appreciation right now for the stakeholder community here in Oregon, really turning out and engaging with us in these technical workshops. We've had over 100 participants at each of these. These have been half-day meetings, a huge time commitment for participants, and we have received an incredible amount of input, a lot of constructive engagement, a lot of constructive disagreement. Frankly, there's a lot of differing opinions in how our state should reduce and provide an overall limit on greenhouse gases in our state. And so we are at the conclusion of that, I guess I would say, second bullet, if you will, if you're following from left to right, there in the scoping process, which means we are just about to embark then on the next phase, which is our series of town hall style public meetings that we're holding the first 2 weeks of next month in October. And at the end of this pre-rulemaking phase, we will be consulting again with you, with our commission, about the results, summarizing what we've heard in that robust engagement process, pre-rulemaking process. And then what we're talking about here today, as Richard mentioned, is how we embark on the next phase, which is our rulemaking process, and how we establish our rules advisory committee specifically. So as Richard mentioned, our intent is for this rules advisory committee to be appointed by the commission at your next meeting, or the decision at our next meeting in November. And so once that rules advisory committee is appointed late this year, the intent is for that process then with our advisory committee to play out throughout most of next year with a public comment period that would open near the end of quarter 3 of next year, and ultimately a proposal to our commission near the end of next year with the schedule then to implement this program, begin implementing this program next year, or the following year, excuse me, in 2022. So I kind of glossed over some of the process points here articulated on this slide, but I think that provides a good high-level overview. Richard, I believe I was going to hand it back to you for the next couple slides.
Yes,
okay.
Colin, thank you.
If we go to the next slide, please.
All right. So I am going to talk about the role of the Rules Advisory Committee. I think it's important for the commission and the public and the partners that we're working with to really have a clear understanding of what the Rules Advisory Committee does and doesn't do. So I'm going to do that in a minute, but before I talk about that, I also want to talk a little bit more broadly about engagement with the public and with a variety of interests, partners, and I'm going to say sovereign nations about these rules. So the Rules Advisory Committee is maybe the most formal way of obtaining engagement and advice about proposed rules, but it does not mean that there are not other parts to how we go about seeking input broadly from the public. And from Oregon tribes also. So I want to start out by saying we are going to make a formal request to each of the Oregon tribes for government-to-government consultation on this rulemaking specifically. That's something we don't always do, but on really big policy issues like this, I think it's really critical that we engage directly with each of the Oregon tribes and offer to come out and sit down with tribal council and talk about the issues, talk about the policy, and hear input from each of the Oregon tribes. So I want the commission and the public and the any tribal representatives to understand that that is very much part of the process here. And that communication will be going out relatively soon from the department. So that is one element. Obviously, there is a public comment period more generally that we always do as part of a rulemaking. And I think we are anticipating probably a fairly lengthy public comment period for this particular rulemaking. But then in addition, and credit to Colin and the team working on these rules, we have set up a process that is really unusual here in terms of rulemaking, in that we started out in phase one of this work by asking for advice on how to have good public engagement. And we received a lot of advice from Oregonians about how to structure a good process for this really important work. One of the recommendations was that we have a rulemaking phase, which is the work that Colin just described, these workshops that really have gone into various aspects of the issues around reducing greenhouse gas emissions in these sectors. And each one has an issue paper that kind of lays out the issues. And we've had virtual half-day workshops on each of these 6 areas, including yesterday's on impacted communities. Really well attended, great discussion in the workshops, a lot of back and forth. And we are using that input in how we set up the more formal part of the rulemaking with the Rulemaking Advisory Committee. So that is part of the engagement process here as well. We also, and thanks to the Oregon Legislature and Governor Brown, have been provided some resources to support engagement from traditionally underrepresented communities. And we are anticipating putting out a procurement for assistance from organizations that represent frontline communities to help be a conduit between DEQ and frontline communities to get information out to those communities, but also to get information in from frontline communities. We're also working with sister agencies, the Department of Land Conservation and Development and ODOT, on some of the other efforts that Colin referred to in the first slide related to other efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to coordinate with them. So all of that, and I'm probably missing some pieces, but the Rules Advisory Committee is kind of the formal core of what is a much larger engagement process that's going on around this really important policymaking. That said, the Rules Advisory Committee is important. It is by Oregon statute required to provide input on the rules and the impacts of the rules. One of the issues that we have heard about already from partners and the public is that it's important that the commission hear not just about the traditional fiscal impacts on the regulated community as part of this rulemaking. We will be doing that analysis, and the Rulemaking Advisory Committee will be looking at those impacts. We're required to do that analysis by statute. We also are looking at impacts on communities that are affected by climate change and impacts on communities that may be affected by the rules that you'll consider. And not just economic impacts on those communities, but also public health impacts. So that's part of the work that we are doing here over the course of the next year, and we're contracting with experts to do some of that analysis. So this is going to be a rulemaking somewhat unlike any state rulemaking that I've been involved in before, and that we are really working to bring to the commission proposals that have really robust public engagement and input and really robust comprehensive analysis of not just fiscal impacts, but environmental and public health impacts as well of this policy. So, all right. That said, again, just to emphasize for the commission, the decision that you'll make in November around membership of this committee, it will be this committee that by statute is giving you certain required input around fiscal impacts of the proposed rules in particular. So next slide, Stephanie. So in approaching this, we've tried to think about some principles about the Rules Advisory Committee for the commission to consider. These are, I would say, beginning intended to be thought-provoking ideas from the department. They're not any sort of formal recommendation, but let me talk through each of these. First of all, size. A lot of this is informed by recent experience that the agency has had around Cleaner Air Oregon, the health-based air toxics program that we've put in place over the last several years. We had a very robust Rules Advisory Committee process for that. And one of the things that we have experienced, and I think other agencies have experienced, is there's a trade-off in terms of size. It needs to be big enough so that we have important interest fairly represented on the Rules Advisory Committee. But once you start getting to a certain size, it becomes difficult for individual members to really fully express their views to other committee members. And it becomes harder to have any sort of back and forth dialogue. So there's a balance there. There's a sweet, if not spot, a range of size. Needs to be representative, but also manageable. One thing that's related to that is the possibility of subgroups or technical advisory groups that are a portion of a Rules Advisory Committee or potentially even a separate informal work group that's providing input. We did that with Cleaner Air Oregon. There was a technical advisory committee also that met early on and then at key points during the rulemaking to provide input. So that's something that we may want to do here. And that may make it possible to have the Rules Advisory Committee be a little bit smaller. Balance. So, and we heard some of this yesterday already in the workshop on impacted communities, and I want to be very upfront with the commission. There were some strong views expressed yesterday in the workshop that already in the next, not the slide that's before you now, but the next slide that Colin will next couple of slides that Colin will present, that we've already provided too much representation from the regulated community and not enough from communities that have borne burdens of air pollution over the years and are also bearing impacts of climate change. So that'll be something for the commission to consider as you look at this going into November. And then finally, capacity, and this is tricky. We are expecting that this work will require the Rules Advisory Committee to meet roughly once a month, beginning in January of 2021, and then going on through late summer to early fall of 2021. There may be additional meetings of work groups or subgroups on specific parts of the rule. The more meetings there are and the more time that is required for the Rules Advisory Committee, that becomes an obstacle to participation by particularly individuals who are challenged in terms of income or are challenged because they're representatives of frontline communities and have 25 things going on at the same time. So we need to be thoughtful and careful about that also, and trying to design a process that is fair in terms of being equally accessible to all the interests that are on the Rules Advisory Committee. So those are just three high-level principles that we've tried to think about as we've talked about this internally and start to put some recommendations in front of the commission. The last thing I want to say, and this is important, is sometimes in rulemakings we are shooting for consensus by a Rules Advisory Committee. And in an ideal world, that would always be the case. I think it was Don Sampson yesterday in the workshop, mentioned the Oregon Way, which is, I recognize as being a former natural resource advisor to Governor Kitzhaber, the Oregon way of trying to make policy by consensus. I'm just going to be really frank with you all. I think it's highly unlikely that we are going to see a consensus around this policy making. There may not be a consensus on the commission. There certainly won't, I think it's almost impossible for us to get a consensus on a Rules Advisory Committee. And frankly, and this is my personal opinion, this is really the commission's call, I don't think we should even necessarily try too hard for a consensus. To me, the most important function of the Rules Advisory Committee here is to fairly represent the points of view of the important interests in Oregon around this policy making. That is, and let the commission make the tough calls about how to balance things. Of course, if there are particular aspects of this where we can achieve consensus, sure, we'll try to do that as much as possible. But we do not have the luxury of slowing down and trying to grind through and create a consensus around the big picture issues on this. We have a very demanding and ambitious goal of trying to provide rules, propose rules to the commission by the beginning of 2022. And we're not, personal opinion again, I do not think a consensus approach is realistic. So that was the high level overview that I wanted to provide. And now I'm going to turn it back to Colin to talk through in a little bit more detail some of the process and some early thoughts about committee structure from the department. So Colin.
Great. Thank you, Richard. If we could go to the next slide, please. So commissioners, what we have here is a proposed process from staff to you for how we go about supporting your decision on how to appoint a Rules Advisory Committee for this rulemaking. And first part of that is this presentation and our staff report that accompanied this, as well as in particular the next slide as well, which when we will talk through the proposed structure of this Rules Advisory Committee. So we'll review that here in the next slide. But as far as the process, as Richard mentioned, ultimately what we're hoping for is a decision by the Commission on how to appoint this advisory committee at your next meeting in November. But between now and then, what we are proposing is that we hold an application period for probably about 3 weeks, realistically, given the space we have between now and your next meeting. And in that period, we would be asking for individuals and organizations to apply, throw their hat in the ring, say, I would like to serve on this advisory committee, and ask as a part of that application that folks identify among a predetermined set of types of interests that they would bring or that they would represent on this committee. And you'll see this in a moment on the next slide, the different perspectives or interests that we think really need to be represented. And I'll be honest, and I'll explain a little bit more about some of the input we've already received. And Richard mentioned this as well. Just yesterday at our final workshop that focused on impacted communities, we got a lot of opinions about this proposed structure, and I want to be honest and share some of that input that we received already. But I'll come back to that in a moment here. So the proposed process is that we would hold an application period following this meeting for the next few weeks, receive applications, and then the department staff would evaluate those applications and recommend then at your next meeting a roster reflecting any direction that you, the Commission, provide to us, as well as the principles that Richard just mentioned. In particular, this finding that sweet spot in the as far as size, as far as balance, and particularly, I'm going to express my own personal opinion here. In particular, the capacity, being sure that we have an advisory committee that has equal capacity across those perspectives, not just equal number of seats, but the equal capacity to represent those differing perspectives. And again, we'll touch on that here on the next slide. So. Hold this application period for the next few weeks. The department will review applications that come through and then recommend a roster to the Commission at your next meeting, or really in advance of your next meeting. And then in your meeting next, or rather in November, that you would consider our recommendation and provide direction as to the who to appoint to that committee. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's the slide I referenced a few times just now. This is the proposal from staff on the committee structure. What you see on the left column there is the different perspectives, and then on the right column, a proposal on the approximate number of individuals that would represent each of those perspectives. So one of the first things I want to mention, maybe it's because it's the first row there, you see the perspective of tribal interests. I think Richard mentioned this already. Tribal interests involvement on this Rules Advisory Committee is not in place of formal government-to-government consultation. So letters are going out later this month, we hope, to initiate that formal government-to-government consultation with Oregon's 9 federally recognized tribes. That is a separate and distinct process. And so, but nonetheless, we also know that it's important to have tribal interests represented in our Rules Advisory Committee as well. But I just want to really emphasize that the formal government-to-government consultation will occur separately. And then what you see in addition, in the next several rows, really are the different types of regulated entities or sectors that this program will be covering. This includes large stationary sources, large manufacturers that emit greenhouse gases in a high volume on site, as well as natural gas suppliers, companies that are supplying natural gas to end users, and then other suppliers of liquid and gaseous fuels, chiefly transportation fuels, gasoline and diesel. And then we have environmental justice communities represented distinctly from any other interests there, including other more maybe traditional environmental or conservation organizations. Couple seats proposed for general business organizations that represent businesses as a sector, local governments, counties, cities, and then we also have a separate perspective for public health, knowing that public health is, in my experience, working in climate policy for a number of years, the connection between climate and public health is increasingly important, increasingly understood, increasingly sought, that we address these issues together. So I think it's really important that we have distinct perspective there for public health. And then we have a couple proposed seats at large. And there were some questions actually we got yesterday at our Impacting Communities workshop about what we mean by that, what is the intent there. And as I explained it yesterday, the proposal, frankly, there is, in case we have missed any perspectives, and I'll mention it in just a moment, so some perspectives that were brought up that folks didn't see on this list. But the at-large category is meant to allow for someone to submit an application that they don't necessarily identify with any one of these perspectives that we've listed above. And so actually I'll mention what we heard yesterday, among many other points of input, was a concern that there were some interests not included here, that included labor. Also included concerns that because the range of different sectors that would be potentially regulated by this community, concerns that overall the totality of seats for regulated entities might tip the balance between those interests, those of regulated entities, as opposed to interests in the emissions and public health implications of this program. So just want to be true to the input we already received yesterday.
Thank you, Colin.
Yeah, I see it.
I think we have a question or comment from Commissioner Kyle.
I do have a question, and my internet's giving me an unstable warning. So if I cut in and out, just signal me and I'll be quiet. And it's kind of a higher order question. I can appreciate the desire to keep this committee lean and the comments that Director Whitman said, as well as, just for the feasibility sake of this type of rulemaking. But we had originally started talking about the greenhouse gas targets that DEQ were going to include were things around the clean fuel, as well as food waste, land use, and a few of those other buckets that would allow us to work within some of the existing programs and the existing structures that we have. So my question is, I see a lot of these large stationary sources and regulated communities in the fossil fuel and in the carbon intensity fuel sector, but I'm not seeing representation from those other programs that would have ties into agriculture if we're talking about food waste, some of the landfill methane capture that had been talked about previously. So I think I would be very curious to either decrease the number of committee seats and increase the diversity of the sectors present in order to try to capture some of the other players that need to be at the table when we're talking about some of the more obvious strategies that we can follow to get to greenhouse gas reductions.
Thank you, Chair George. Okay, Commissioner Kyle, there is a reason for that, and the reason is there will be a separate rulemaking on clean fuels. There will be a separate rulemaking on landfill methane. So to some degree, I think the reason you're not seeing those policymaking pieces there is because there'll be a separate rulemaking. They'll have their own rules advisory committee. That said, and I'm going to throw this back to Colin a little bit, alternative compliance mechanisms. One of the policy areas that will be in this cap and reduce rulemaking does have to do with to what degree or whether, how you are going to authorize what are called alternative compliance mechanisms, which essentially come down to achieving greenhouse gas reductions in other ways than direct reductions in these types of regulated entities. So there is some potential there for involvement of other activities. I think I'll just leave it at that. What I would urge some careful thinking about is I don't think we want that discussion to swallow the main discussion, which is the mechanics of the cap and reduce program. But I'd invite Colin to weigh in here.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. I think what you see represented here, particularly in the, I'm going to say the middle swath of this table here, are the sectors and types of entities we think this cap and reduce program is likely to directly regulate. Whereas yes, as Richard mentioned, we intend to have separate rules and separate rules advisory committees in some of those areas that Commissioner Kyle, you mentioned, such as our clean fuels program, as well as landfills and the methane that is emitted from landfills. However, as Richard mentions, a program like this cap and reduce program, we have identified, we had a whole workshop structured around a discussion of what types of, as we call them, alternative compliance mechanisms might we incorporate as a part of this program. And there, what we talked about, among other things, was how to include or to credit, incentivize under this cap and reduce program, reductions of greenhouse gases in other sectors outside of fossil fuels and large stationary sources. So those could include reductions from landfills, for example, or other reductions in Oregon's natural working lands. And so I think there is the potential for this rule and the program it establishes to connect with other sectors or other types of or sources of greenhouse gases. So there could be reason to include representation specifically from some of those sources. I will definitely acknowledge that. What you see here proposed really is I'm going to say traditional interests that arise around this area. In my experience, interests as represented here, local governments, business organizations, public health, and environmental justice and in environmental conservation interests. And then, as I mentioned, kind of in the middle swath of this table, the sectors that we believe that are likely to be directly regulated. So, but the plan, I think, is well taken, that this program has the potential to be broader than that. So we could include a representation outside of that.
Yeah, and I can appreciate how this is, it does reflect the traditional players that have been involved in this, but I think we've almost exhausted, even though you're just starting this, I really would encourage and like to see some creativity in bringing other players, because I don't think the traditional methods have worked so far. So we do you know, agriculture has a big role to play in this. Forestry has a big role to play in this. Transportation has a big role to play in this, you know, consumer. So I think we need more voices at the table to find those solutions that won't, I agree with Richard, I don't think we'll get consensus rulemaking on this, but it would have creativity and new thinking in how to get to the goals that I think we all can agree on. But it is going to take adopting different perspectives and being more inclusive in these discussions than I think we've been previously. So I could see a way forward where reduce the number of committee seats per perspective, but add voices that are currently not in here in order to get a more full picture of what the options are that Oregon can have that would take advantage of some of the unique resources and the unique opportunities that we do have in the state to cap and reduce.
Thank you. Vice Chair Barrasso.
Colin, I just want to thank you on this and obviously all your ongoing work on this. It's incredibly aggressive. And so I know there's a lot of pieces you're balancing. So maybe the only thing I would add is I feel like looking at this list, it will come down to, you know, the particular sort of slate you ultimately bring back to us in November and how that looks. I think my worries is 3 weeks for recruitment is really tight. And so, you know, I know you've been doing those, the technical workshops. And so I assume people sort of are cued in and teed up for this, but in that, I think, I don't know where the give is as you see sort of as you're going towards the end of your 3 weeks. I know when I've run recruitment, I generally don't try to see any names, except I usually ask, I keep it actually separate from me. And I usually ask the bureau that's running it, like, just give me demographic statistics to know, am I capturing representative, you know, is this a representative sample at least that I'm recruiting, just to keep, you know, protect the sanctity of the process. So I think that's just something you're gonna have to look to. And I know that everything is so tight that I don't know where you have any wiggle room. But making sure that as that 3 weeks opens, that starting day one, we often miss the boat in terms of really making sure we're doing outreach until like the last couple of weeks, but you're really hitting the ground with some of those harder to reach communities early on. So that's my worry, is the timeline. And then as far as thinking about sort of your process, you know, I know that you say that you've got here that staff is going to evaluate the applications and recommend sort of a slates, or whether it's a couple of different slates, whatever. I'm intrigued to see how that comes to us in terms of sort of the options, because that's I know you're coming up with a balanced package of, you know, whether it's option A, here's the balanced package, option B. But what I would ask is, in that staff group that is doing those recommendations, I think that group is just as important in terms of sort of from a process perspective. So I would hope that you have, I hope that you have a balanced gender on that group of just staff that are picking these names out, that I hope it does skew towards women. I hope you do have representative in terms of just demographics, making sure you do have Black folks, Indigenous folks, people of color on that even subgroup, because there's just different thinking that's going to come in to say, okay, the way you got this group made out, some of these voices are going to be marginalized without a couple other voices. And so just to be able to think about those dynamics around the sort of slate that you're putting together, I really want you all to think about who actually is the staff that's informing that, because that'll be just as influential in terms of making sure that this is sort of a productive cohort. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you, Vice Chair Barrasso. I think that's really important input. And as I was looking at the list, you know, I'd just like to share as well, I think we can see how the folks you're trying to recruit are going to interact with what Richard rightly called the tricky situation of capacity. There are folks and interests who you want at the table, you want their voices heard. And yet when we look at this list, there's simply no question that there are some interests represented on this list that will have paid staff or lobbyists available immediately to sign up. They could easily fill 2 to 3 seats, probably a great deal more. There are other interests on this list who may care about this and be very interested in this issue, but may lack the capacity to have someone who can sit in once a month for some indefinite period and spend the associated amount of time just working on the issue. So undoubtedly you'll see that play out to some degree, Colin, as you find those right nominees. And that may affect to some degree your final proposal as well. There are just some of these categories where, you know, I don't know if you'll get two folks to sit on the tribal interest board. You might not. So I certainly hope you do, but we do appreciate the conscientiousness with which you're undertaking this. And so I look forward to hearing more. Commissioner Mosby.
Yes, hey, Colin, I just was going to say, I appreciate all the work you've put into this. I agree with Richard. I think you'll have a tough time finding consensus. You've got, looks like 21 to 24 slots allotted. And from my history, committees of that size are really tough to work with. I find 7 to 10 people, you can agree on 80% of the things and come to some consensus. But when you have a group, almost 25 people, if you put your staff in there, you're going to be over that. I think you've got your work cut out for you. Just do the best you can. You're trying to include everyone, but sometimes, you know, more focused group of maybe half that size would be, I think, more rewarding. So I'll leave it at that.
Yes, Commissioner Addington.
Thanks, and thanks, Colin. I need to go back, I think probably, and I will go back to the front of this presentation and just listen again. I got a little confused about the separate work racks that are going to be part of this, the clean fuels, the greenhouse gas emissions, and just sort of how that all weaves together in the end. So I'm thinking a little bit about that, and you know whether there are more appropriate places for, you know, certain stakeholders or not. But I guess I've been I think I've been clear with this group that I want to bring a maybe a little different perspective to this commission, and I think some of that is a rural perspective and an ag and forestry perspective, and I just don't know how they fit in here. I'm not trying to put my thumb on the scale. I'm not trying to suggest an imbalance in any way, but I just think when you talk about the bulk of the lands, and you referred to working lands in Oregon, they're a huge part of this. I'm not sure I understand completely what alternative compliance mechanisms are, but I think I might have an idea what those are. And it just seems like that they would have to be a part of this. And so I think the tribal interests certainly are going to have a rural perspective, and I appreciate that. Maybe local governments, but boy, to me, there's a chunk missing there.
Thank you, Commissioner. Well, and that is certainly think about when you talk about local governments, is the regional kind of, you know, diversity. Are we thinking about a metropolitan and some more rural? Colin, do you have a take on that?
Yeah, Chair George, commissioners, I do think in our internal discussions around that row in particular, the discussion has really centered around having both urban and rural representation on the committee, specifically. But that said, what I'm hearing as well is, you know, where are the interests specific to ag, specific to forestry, specific to, you know, Oregon's natural and working lands, and those could arise in a few different perspectives here that we've already identified, but they could also be called out specifically as separate interests, and that's what I'm hearing some interest from the commission to seeing those voices, to seeing those types of perspectives brought out here, and I acknowledge that they could definitely be represented in some of these existing perspectives that we've identified, but they could also be called out separately and distinctly.
That's worth saying too. There are some categories here where they could fit. Commissioner Kyle.
So I'll just put a finer point on it. Actually, is I think that they do need to be called out specifically. I think we need representation from the working lands. They're part of the solution. They might not be directly regulated under these components, but at least getting their voices and being able to see that they were part of the conversation, I think is going to be very important.
Okay. I think we had better continue unless Director or Colin, you have some more specific questions for the commissioners now. I think we've gotten some input from them, and we know you've got your work cut out for you.
Thank you, Chair George. I think this is the sort of input that we were looking for, this sort of feedback, and so we will look at specific representation around the working lands. We have thought a lot about the size already, and Commissioner Mosby, for you, yeah, we've had the conversation already about should it be 12 or should it be 20, and I think just once you start lining out all these competing concerns, we're probably going to be up in the 20 range in terms of what we come to you with for a recommendation. I will say we made that work on Cleaner Air Oregon. It was not easy. It was a big lift, and it also made reaching consensus less likely. But I think we could probably handle a rack of that size for this, and it's certainly in terms of complexity and all the interest. This one's even more, you know, it's almost an order of magnitude more than Cleaner Air Oregon, which is kind of scary, but there we are. So I appreciate the input. This has been very helpful, Chair George and commissioners. We will take all this input and do our very best with a good application process and come back to you with a specific recommendation for the November commission meeting.
Yes, Chair George, commissioners, thank you for the input and really appreciate your time today.
Great. All right. And is the conclusion of this presentation?
It is, yes. Stephanie put the last slide up there. I didn't transition to it, but you guys, the commission naturally went right there to the discussion and discussed the questions on that last slide. Thank you.
All right. Very good. Thank you very much. Okay, it is now just before 11, and we have some more presentations, some more meaty presentations coming up. So I do think it is going to be important to take a quick break. Everyone, can we be back at 10 after the hour? All right, I'm seeing some nodding heads. All right, take a quick break. We'll see you folks back here in about 11 minutes. And here are the recording prompts starting. So welcome back, everyone. Thanks for being fairly disciplined about our break. You know, we can't help, it continues to come out throughout our meeting, the unique and very different times we're in, whether we're talking about, you know, COVID or fires or smoke or thunderstorms or budget. I know that as I just took my break, I walked, well, we've got the Environmental Quality Commission going on here in this small office. We've got middle school going on in the dining room and a high school going on in the living room. So I don't know about everybody else's situation, but they are unique days indeed. So, but we are very glad that you're here with us today to give us the Agency Toxics Reduction Strategy update. So welcome, Leah, Kevin, and Dan.
Thank you, Chair George, and thanks for the reminder that, you know, none of us are alone in the crazy home situations that we have going on. I think that's appreciated probably by everybody. So thank you, Chair George and commissioners. For the record, my name is Leah Feldon. I'm the Deputy Director at DEQ. And this is an informational item for you today. And this is an update on DEQ's toxics reduction strategy. I believe you last had an update on the strategy in January 2019. It's been a little bit of time now, and we said that we would come back in about a year to a year and a half's time to give you an update to that update, which at the time was when we had done the sort of every 5-year update that we do to the strategy. So today's update, the strategy itself has not been updated. Today is more about telling you where we're at in implementing that updated strategy that we had brought to you in 2019. So I'm going to kick us off here, but Kevin and Dan are going to do the majority of the presentation for you as the subject matter experts for this toxics reduction strategy work at the agency. Kevin Masterson, as you all well know, is our senior toxics reduction strategy guru at DEQ, and really manages all things related to the strategy and the implementation work that we do. And Dan Brown has been serving for a while now as our project manager. So he's managing a couple groups at DEQ around this work. One is the Team Toxics that does the implementation work around the strategy. And then he also project manages the sort of management or governance team. It's called the Team Toxics Governance Team that oversees the work for Team Toxics. So with that, I can go to slide 2, please. So as you may recall, just a bit of background on the strategy itself to get us oriented again. The purpose of the strategy, since its inception in 2012, I believe, was to create a framework for the agency that would complement and support the toxics work that we have going on in all of the programs, water, air, and land. So we recognize that many toxic pollutants readily cross our environmental media boundaries that we create for our own organization, but many toxic pollutants don't, of course, respect those boundaries. And as such, our approach needs to be integrated and comprehensive. The strategy describes what actions DEQ and partners will take and the things that DEQ should prioritize to further our toxics reduction work. The partnership aspect is important. It's noted here, and you'll hear it a couple times in any presentation we do on the toxics reduction strategy. This work happens largely because of partnerships. DEQ has a role and responsibility with regard to toxics, but there's so much work that really only can happen with partnerships in place. The strategy also aims to focus actions on addressing toxics at all stages of the life cycle, including an upstream approach of pollution prevention. And this can help us achieve greater gains by reducing pollutants at their source, rather than trying to remove chemicals from the environment once they've been released. And the updated strategy includes 14 strategy actions that are underway or in the planning stages that incorporate the characteristics that are highlighted on this slide. Okay, next slide, please. The strategy, as I mentioned earlier, was updated in 2019. And several of the guiding principles stayed largely the same from the original 2012 strategy. One such principle was to build on the success of actions that were implemented as part of the 2012 toxics reduction strategy. For example, broad support and stable funding was secured for the Pesticide Stewardship Partnership Program, which has allowed the program to work on reducing pesticides in water in more areas of the state. One recommended enhancement to that program in the current updated strategy is to incorporate environmental justice considerations into the program. the interagency team and the stakeholder advisory group for the pesticide stewardship program are addressing this in their planning efforts. And that stakeholder advisory group, Kevin will have to correct me if you want to know the exact timing of its inception, but that's relatively new. And so that, I believe, has come together just in the last, maybe about a year ago at most. And I think they're having a lot of success in working with the agencies, DEQ and Department of Agriculture specifically. The 2012 strategy also coincided and coordinated with a governor's executive order on green chemistry, which allowed DEQ to support and advance the reduction of toxics through state product purchasing. And this purchasing work continues under the updated strategy, with more synergy occurring between materials management program and the toxics reduction priorities. The 2012 strategy emphasized taking an integrated approach and leveraging collaborative partnerships to achieve more reductions, as I mentioned before. And the 2019 update to the strategy added principles of ensuring effective communication, incorporating environmental justice interests, and maintaining engagement with communities. So that's really our introduction into the meat of this presentation. So with that, I'm going to hand the presentation over now to Dan Brown, as mentioned, our project manager, and Kevin Masterson, our agency toxics coordinator.
All right, good morning and hello, Chair George and commissioners. This is Dan Brown. Stephanie, can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. And so I'll give you sort of an intro into the updates that we did for our toxics focus list. I'd like to start out with saying just what is this list and how do we use it? The list itself was originally developed as part of the initial 2012 DEQ toxics reduction strategy. It's a cross-program list of priority chemicals derived from 10 priority lists used by DEQ, OHA, and other regional initiatives. The list helps direct implementation of strategy actions. Given that there are tens of thousands of chemicals in commerce, we need to focus on a smaller subset of chemicals and pollutants. Our list also informs others about agency-wide toxics reduction priorities, including other entities in Oregon and outside the state who are interested in state toxic chemical priorities, such as retailers interested in reducing certain chemicals and products. Other considerations in updating the focus list was derived from existing state and regional priority lists for regulatory pollution prevention and environmental assessment programs. For the recent update, our leadership directed us to place more emphasis on public health, and we did this by designating the consumer use and commercial product chemical category as a separate media type, along with air, water, and land quality. Adding chemicals from the 2015 Toxics Free Kids Act priority chemical list to those in consideration for the focus list. Also, we included Cleaner Air Oregon emission inventory data and drinking water monitoring data in a list of considered chemicals. Next slide. The criteria for a chemical to make it on the focus list are the same as they were in 2012. It needs to be on 3 or more established program priority lists across at least 2 of our environmental media. The difference between the 2012 development process and the current one is that there are now 10 instead of 12 priority lists to draw from, and there are now 4 environmental media categories instead of 3 due to the addition of the consumer and commercial products that I previously mentioned. This addition allows us to bring in more public health information, as I mentioned, was suggested by our leadership. There are several water quality related toxic chemical or pollutant priority lists used by DEQ or interagency collaborations, whereas the DEQ Air Quality Division has a single updated priority list based on data from multiple sources, including that Cleaner Air Oregon, again, as I mentioned before. All chemicals on the 10 existing priority lists are contained in a master spreadsheet that we call our base list, which is available on our website or by request. Next slide, please, Stephanie. Here's a closer look at the 10 priority lists that inform the focus list. I won't talk about each of the lists in particular, but I do want to point out a couple. First, the addition of that Toxics Free Kids Act list under consumer care products was a way for DEQ to incorporate more public health concerns into the focus list. I'd also like to point out, we worked in collaboration with the Columbia River Toxics Reduction Working Group to update our respective priority lists. We used their contaminant of concern list to update the focus list and vice versa, which allowed both to influence implementation of toxics monitoring and toxics reduction efforts on a larger scale. And next slide, please. Thank you. So using the updated program chemical priority lists and applying the criteria discussed, 14 chemicals were added to the focus list, while 5 were removed from the list, and for a net gain of 9 chemicals or classes of chemicals. As a result, we now have a total of 60 chemicals or chemical classes on the focus list. Additions included 5 consumer and commercial product constituents, 4 metals, 3 volatile organic compounds, and 2 flame retardants. Of the 5 removed chemicals on the focus list, 4 were pesticides, 2 of which were current use pesticides and 2 were legacy pesticides. And that's the end of mine, so I'll hand this presentation now over to Kevin Masterson.
Hello, Chair George and Commissioners. I'm Kevin Masterson. I'm the DEQ Agency Toxics Coordinator. I'll just pick up where Dan left off here. Next slide, please, Stephanie. So this is the table that shows all of the focus list chemicals or classes of chemicals. And you can see by the additions in red that Dan briefly talked about, you can see the specific chemicals that were added in the different categories. The chemicals that have strike-throughs through them are the ones that have been deleted from the list. So one of the more noteworthy additions to the list that we wanted to point out is the inclusion of per and polyfluoral alkyl substances, or PFAS, which have been getting a lot of attention across the country and in Oregon as emerging highly persistent environmental contaminants, especially for drinking water. And we're spending a fair bit of time these days on PFAS, as Leah can attest to. 4 other chemicals that are common ingredients in consumer and commercial products also made that list, including vinyl chloride. The addition of the Toxics Free Kids Act priority list that Dan referenced was a major factor in those chemicals being included on the focus list. That Toxics Free Kids Act list was also one of the drivers for the additional metals and volatile organic compounds on the list, although the updates to air quality, water quality, and cleanup program priority lists that just happened earlier this year also contributed to the additions of some of those types of chemicals. In terms of what was removed from the list, I just want to briefly touch on that because we do get questions related to that. The 2 current use pesticides removed from the list right now don't meet the water quality concentration and detection frequency criteria that our interagency pesticide management team has established. And those criteria are established for designating pesticides of high concern and pesticides of moderate concern across the state. So we're just not seeing them at the levels and frequency that would warrant being priorities. And then the 2 legacy pesticides that made the list in 2012 were on there because of 2 program priority lists that we no longer use at DEQ. They're not really relevant. They haven't been updated for a long time. And so those were 2 lists that have been dropped off the focus list calculations. They were not and still are not cleanup program drivers. So I think it's important to note that. Next slide, please. So we don't have time today. We wanted to make this a pretty brief update, but we don't have time to provide a comprehensive overview of the implementation status of all of the strategy actions, but we did want to highlight a couple just briefly. The first, besides, of course, the focus list, is one related to advancing transition to safer chemicals and products. And Leah highlighted the emphasis that we have in the strategy of going upstream to try to reduce toxics. And this is an example of that. We're using EPA grant funds and leveraging interstate collaborations to advance assessments of alternatives to some of these focus list chemicals that we're talking about, and to avoid what we call regrettable substitutions. And so making those substitutions more informed through assessment is something that we're working on with other states and other entities. We've used some of those funds to work with Northwest Green Chemistry, which is a research nonprofit in the region, on a roadmap for conducting comprehensive alternatives assessments for PFAS, or per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, in food packaging. It's a major use of PFAS. This roadmap that was developed is also being used by others outside of Oregon, including the Washington Department of Ecology and their contractor. They've been mandated by the legislature to phase out PFAS in food packaging and assess alternatives. Most recently, we're close to finalizing a report and technical assistance fact sheets in concert with Northwest Green Chemistry again, on chemical alternatives and pollution prevention opportunities for priority air toxics. We looked at those emission inventory reports to identify chemicals that were used in high quantities and had high hazard potential. So the next step is to use those written materials, those fact sheets in the report, and other information to develop online training. So it would be a module that could be used by agency staff as well as industrial users of those chemicals. So we'll tailor that training for industrial users later on. A similar training module will be developed that focuses on phthalate alternatives. So the audience for that training would be more people involved in institutional purchasing. Over the past several months, we've also been working closely with other states, as well as the State Fire Marshal's Office and local government agencies, on identifying information and data needs on alternatives to PFAS-based firefighting foam, which is one of the primary sources of PFAS environmental contamination in Oregon and the nation. And that work will be continuing over the next several months. Next slide. And lastly, we just wanted to highlight some work on diesel particulate emissions assessment and reduction, because you've heard a lot about diesel in previous meetings from the air quality program, and the toxics reduction happens to include two short-term actions that are intended to assess and reduce diesel emissions. And these actions were included in the strategy because our internal toxics team recognized the impacts of diesel emissions to land and water, as well as air, of course, and identified an opportunity to assist the air quality program in determining ways to make these short-term activities more long-term and sustainable. So these actions are also, of course, elements of the larger set of DEQ's off-road and on-road diesel reduction and assessment plans. So I just wanted to briefly highlight these projects. One is assessing diesel emissions and impacts, and this is using an EPA grant. Environmental justice considerations are an integral part of this work, and there are 3 phases to the project. The first one has been completed, and that is performing a vulnerability assessment and identifying emissions factors for rail, marine, and construction and trucking. This involved mapping areas of high social vulnerability, with input variables in the map being diesel particulate, nitrogen dioxide, population, and a series of socioeconomic variables, including poverty rate, education level, age, and race. And again, that task is complete. The second phase is neighborhood monitoring, which is also underway. and stationary monitoring locations have been established in both the Cully and Jade neighborhoods in Portland. Third phase is community engagement. And some initial contacts to community organizations have been made by both Portland State University and DEQ, but more concerted engagement efforts are going to happen after the monitoring data is fully analyzed. Also, some engagement activities may be delayed because of the pandemic. Next, let's stay on this slide and go to building demand for diesel engines. This is the second diesel action that's in the toxics reduction strategy. And it's focused on building demand for those clean diesel engines through a construction collaborative with Portland area local governments and their construction contractors. And DEQ's role in the project is to provide technical assistance to those local agencies. And it's funded by a legislative allocation through House Bill 2007. There are 4 phases to this particular project. The first phase was standard development, which applies to non-road diesel equipment greater than 25 horsepower and on-road dump trucks and cement mixers used in large construction projects. The clean diesel construction equipment standard was drafted after conducting research on what's happening in other parts of the country and reaching out to the local contracting community. The second phase of this project was getting community feedback on the standard and then refining it and adopting it. A stakeholder involvement workshop was conducted, and the feedback from that workshop was incorporated into the draft standard. So that standard has now been finalized and has been officially adopted by 4 of the 5 metro area local governments. I believe the Port of Portland is working on pursuing adoption at this time. So that standard includes tiered requirements for equipment and vehicle model year requirements and will be phased in starting sometime after 2021. Obviously, the pandemic is changing timelines for this project as well as many others. Starting sometime after 2021, the lowest tier of non-road diesel engines will be prohibited. And then by 2026, all non-road diesel engines must meet federal tier 4 emission standards, which is the highest level. Phase 3 of the program is really focused on preparing for implementation and doing program design. So specific program needs have already been identified, including IT resources, technical and financial assistance, and staffing needs for the project. The budget's been improved, and there are a few other tasks that are currently in progress, including identifying financial support to help construction businesses, especially those that are minority, women-owned, disadvantaged, and emerging small businesses, to make sure that they can comply with this standard. And then creating communication tools and planning and conducting outreach events and activities for the construction community. And the implementation will fully begin sometime after 2021. So we just wanted to highlight those 2 diesel actions as well as the advancement of alternatives, safer alternatives as examples of things we're implementing right now. You can go to the next slide, Stephanie. This is a slide just showing who's involved in this effort at DEQ, both Team Toxics, which is the staff team. We have representation from all of our programs and divisions, as well as regional representation, and then the governance team that Leah mentioned, which meets every 6 weeks or so to get updates on what's going on with the strategy and to help overcome any barriers that we're having. I think that is it. Next slide. Are there any questions for any of us on this work?
Questions or comments, commissioners? Vice Chair Barrasso. Vice Chair Barrasso, I think you might have, oh, you know, your mute is not on, but I can't hear you.
No, I have 2 lines of mute, sorry. I just want to thank you, Kevin. I know this is really it's really important in just breaking down some of the silos where things don't get caught. And we know those, we know that a lot of the pollutants that we're talking about go across many mediums. So I really appreciate this. And I just want to know, for my own understanding, how many other states are doing work like this, where they're taking this sort of cross-medium approach to addressing toxics?
Commissioner Barrasso, Chair George, and commissioners, that's a good question. This is something obviously we're doing of our own accord, that we identified the need to be more effective and efficient in using our toxics reduction resources. And there are other states that are doing similar efforts, but not exactly the same. For instance, the state of Washington has what they call a chemical action plan, and they've been working on these chemical action plans for the last 15 or 20 years. Right now, they're focused on PFAS chemicals. But unlike ours, they are really focused on one class of chemicals at a time. I think they started with lead, they went to flame retardants, I believe. And so they picked off these individual sets of chemicals and then gotten everybody involved within their agency at Department of Ecology, as well as State Department of Health and other entities, to implement that chemical action plan. So it's a bit of a different cross-media approach than what we've taken, which is to identify all these chemicals and then actions that are generally more focused on the work and the chemicals that are on the list, on the focus list we talked about, kind of inform how we get those actions done. So right now, Department of Ecology is finishing up their chemical action plan on PFAS. But I don't know if other states are doing something exactly like we are.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I'm not seeing any other hands right now. However, you're not going to entirely miss your opportunity to ask questions about this general topic, even though our next agenda item is going to be more specific to the Willamette watershed. In some ways, of course, is very directly related. So why don't we go ahead and get the Willamette Watershed Toxics Reduction Partnership update underway, and any questions that we haven't thought of yet, we'll still get a shot at. So, and Kevin, I think you are staying with us for this update, and we should be joined by Mary Lou Sosha of the Environmental Protection Agency. Welcome, Mary Lou.
Chair George.
Yes, Director.
Thank you. For the record, Richard Whitman, Oregon DEQ Director. Yes, for this presentation, we've got Kevin Masterson from DEQ again. Thank you, Kevin. And joining us also, Mary Lou Sosha from US EPA Region 10. I'm going to give just a very quick introduction to this. This report is regarding an effort that came out of the Portland Harbor Superfund Record of Decision made back in 2017, I think, right at the beginning of 2017. Part of the decision at that time by EPA and Oregon DEQ was that we should also be looking above Portland Harbor Superfund site in the Willamette River and the Willamette River watershed to see if there are particular areas that are contributing contaminants of concern, particularly PCBs, downstream into the Portland Harbor Superfund reach. So that work, looking to see that source of contaminants coming into the Superfund site is being adequately controlled, has been underway for a bit here and is still underway, and that's the purpose of the update today. Thanks, and I'll turn it over to Kevin and Mary Lou.
Thank you, Director Whitman. That was an excellent introduction to this work. And this is just going to be a very brief update, but we did want to let people know about it since it has been about 3 years since this effort was launched. And it's taken a few twists and turns, but we're pretty excited about some of the work that's happening. And we thought this update on the Willamette Toxics Reduction Partnership would pair really well with the update to the DEQ toxics reduction strategy. There are obvious connections there. Next slide. As Director Whitman referenced, this really comes out of the record of decision for the Portland Harbor cleanup, and in government-to-government discussions prior to the signing of the record of decision at the end of 2016, beginning of 2017, Columbia Basin tribes in particular conveyed concerns to EPA about upstream toxic contaminants that are impacting fish and fish consumption in the harbor after cleanup actions were completed. And so this partnership was launched to achieve those broader environmental improvements beyond what the cleanup actions in the harbor were going to achieve. And this would all be happening through collaboration. So the partnership was convened for the first time in May of 2017 to work on watershed assessments and a plan to reduce upstream toxics, and has been co-led by DEQ and EPA. Next slide. And the original goals of the partnership that are outlined in the record of decision were to first compile existing watershed contamination data and to identify any gaps that might be there. To describe existing efforts to reduce toxics in the watershed and evaluate how well those programs were working and where improvements might be made. Thirdly, to investigate and characterize potential upstream sources of toxic contamination to the harbor. And finally, to identify new strategies to reduce contaminant loading, which could include a broad range of actions from water discharge controls to pollution prevention approaches for both point and non-point sources. Next slide. Oops, I think we might be missing one slide. There we go. So one of the initial actions taken by the partnership, in keeping with those original goals I just mentioned, was to conduct an assessment of river sediments in the upper reach of the river between the Selwood Bridge and Willamette Falls. EPA provided funds to DEQ to work on this assessment, and that began in 2017. The focus of this work was to look at some of the priority pollutants for the harbor, which, as Director Whitman mentioned, PCBs, primary risk driver, but also organochlorine pesticides like DDT and its breakdown products, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs, and dioxins and furans. A follow-up assessment occurred in 2019, which largely confirmed the conclusions from the first phase of the assessment, which really was that the areas of contamination appear localized and that the contamination is not expected to impact Portland Harbor Superfund sites, the site itself. So, and that was a significant conclusion and really made the assessment work worthwhile. But that is continuing, as I mentioned, in 2019. Not only was there additional work done on the upriver reach, but some further characterization is being planned for this fall. It was somewhat delayed, but work is now restarting on this effort to characterize, in particular, dioxin and furine concentrations in the upriver reach between Selwood Bridge and Willamette Falls. This work is also funded by EPA and being implemented by DEQ, so we can differentiate background concentrations from any source-related contamination. And then this work that's happening this year will also characterize sediment conditions in the Selwood Riverfront Park area. And 2 sampling events have already been conducted and show generally low levels of contamination. And additional sampling is going to be conducted soon to ensure the extent and levels of contamination are well understood. So next slide, and I'll turn it over to Mary Lou.
Good morning, Chair George and members of the Commission. It's an honor to speak to you today. And as Director Whitman said, and also Kevin as well, one of the original visions that came out of the record of decision was to develop a toxics reduction plan for the watershed above Portland Harbor. And at the same time that we were working on this, EPA was working with the Northwest Power and Conservation Council, with Oregon DEQ and other partners for a story map on PAHs in the Columbia River Basin. And we sort of realized the power of a story map and also the ability to reach out to citizens and communities as an educational tool. And we decided that for the Willamette River, instead of a watershed plan that would just go on a shelf and be very static, a story map could be a more dynamic way to tell the story about toxics in the Willamette River. And then I was successful in getting some funds through the EPA Urban Waters Program to help fund contractor assistance in developing the story map. So that was very exciting. Next slide. So just a little bit of information. We're going to go into the story map in a couple minutes, and it's just really wonderful thing. But I just want to just tell you a little bit about this collaboration, and also as we heard, it builds on the Columbia River collaboration that's been going on. We have over almost 30 different partners. We've had meetings, 2 to 3 meetings a year. We use the meetings to exchange information on monitoring, on toxic reduction actions. It's also been a really good platform for the Clean Rivers Coalition, which is the group of MS4 permittees and wastewater permittees that are working together to develop outreach and other types of communication efforts to change personal actions. And something really good came out of that, which I'll talk about in just a minute. And we have a website that we've established, and it includes all the information on our collaboration, including the principles that we developed. It includes materials people can go in if they're not able to attend the meetings. They can go in and access those materials. And our next meeting is set up on November 18th, and it's going to be a virtual meeting. And I think what's really interesting with these virtual meetings is there's a lot more equity. And people who couldn't, Chair George was talking in the previous presentation earlier about the capacity. And there's a lot more equity in virtual meetings, so everybody can participate in them. And so I think that's going to bring a really good thing to this work effort, and it's something for us to think about in the future. Next slide, please. So I wanted to just use this time to also just have a celebration for Oregon and the whole Columbia River Basin, because we're talking about toxics, and we just, on Wednesday, we announced 14 grants as a part of our inaugural Columbia River Basin Restoration Program grant program. And it came from monies from FY19 and FY20. We awarded $2 million in grants to tribal governments, local governments, state governments, community groups, universities, and NGOs. And it's very exciting. And I just wanted to highlight really quickly the grants that were awarded for Oregon. Next slide, please. So Salmon Safe is going to increase pesticide stewardship partnerships. And we all know that the state of Oregon is the one that invented these amazing concepts of farmers and regulatory agencies working together. And now this is expanding throughout the basin. They're also going to do that work in Washington and Idaho. The Pacific Northwest Resource Pollution Center, Pacific Northwest Pollution Prevention Resource Center is going to expand the Oregon EcoBiz and Safer Chemicals program. The Lower Columbia Estuary Partnership is going to develop stormwater rain gardens. So this gratis boxes that the Port of Vancouver developed, where they take these containers and then they make them into stormwater green infrastructure. Pacific Conservation and Development Council is going to increase stormwater green infrastructure in a number of watershed councils in the upper Willamette. The Yakima Nation is going to be working with a whole bunch of different partners to develop a comprehensive monitoring plan from the Pacific Ocean all the way up to the Canadian border on the Columbia. The University of Washington, out of the Tacoma Urban Waters Research Center, is going to monitor contaminants of emerging concern in the Lower Columbia, actually starting in the Willamette River and going further down the river. Multnomah County is going to be working on developing bilingual outreach materials as a part of the Clean Rivers Coalition to reduce residential herbicide and insecticide use. And then Columbia Riverkeeper is going to developing an education and outreach program targeting youth and citizens on toxics reduction, on pollution prevention, and there's also a focus there on the Latino community. So it's a celebration for all, and it's good news in a time of not like good news. And thanks for letting me just share this information with you guys. Next slide, please. And I think we're moving into the story map, right? So the story map was, as I said, it was developed as an alternative to a watershed plan. And Stephanie, are we going to be going into the map or just running through the slides?
Thank you, Mary Lou. This is Stephanie Caldera, the EQC assistant. I am hopefully transitioning over to the River Stories webpage, which you should be seeing coming up on your screen to be a more live demonstration.
Fabulous. Thank you, Stephanie. So this story map is a combination between a web page using StoryPress and then story maps using the ESRI technology. And so we developed 8 story maps that we thought would be really important just to tell the stories, like how pollutants harm fish and wildlife, legacy pollution in the Willamette River, how pollutants are entering the Willamette River. And I'm not going to read all these, but I encourage you to go into the story map because we're just really excited about it. It's great. But one of the things that we were trying to do, and this goes back to Chair George's earlier comment, we were recognizing that we didn't have capacity for the tribal people and also other sort of underserved environmental justice communities to be at the table. And we wanted to represent their voice in the story map. So we worked really closely with the Yakima Nation and also with their tribal council. The same thing, we worked with the Grand Ronde Tribe and their tribal council. And we worked with an environmental group called the Blueprint Foundation, where they educate Black and also tribal youth and help mentor them and provide like 95% graduation rates as a result. And I think we're going to go into the maps just a little bit. The Yakima one, I think, whichever one's first, Stephanie, is fine. Oh, so this is, I think this is the Grand Ronde map, right? And this just shows, oh no, that was the, yeah, sorry. Okay, I think this is the Yakima Nation map. It tells a story about the treaty story, and we're not going to go into the whole thing, but this shows lamprey harvest, and maybe Stephanie, we should just move on to the. I know we're running short on time, so maybe we should move to the Grand Ronde. So this story map, we worked with the Grand Ronde Tribe, and as I said, with the Tribal Council on this to get approval, and it tells a story about the Willamette River fish and why they're so important and why clean water and soil matter. And maybe, Stephanie, maybe we could go to just the first page. Yeah. So it tells the story of that ancestral homeland. And Chair George, I don't know if you've had a chance to look at this, but I think you would be proud to look at this. I'm proud of it.
I haven't yet, Mary Lou. I look forward to it.
Yes, I'm proud. I'm very proud of it. So, and it's just the story of the tribe. We were able to give the tribes a platform here, which is just so. I think it's so necessary and needed. And then maybe Stephanie, want to move into Grounding Waters and Blueprint Foundation. And thanks, Stephanie. You're doing a fabulous job. Goodness gracious. This is a grand experiment here. Okay, so I mentioned Grounding Waters is a program. It's an environmental science mentoring program. And they have, it's a part of the Blueprint Foundation. They're focused on Black youth. They just have these like above 90% high school graduation rates. It's headed by this fabulous guy who's actually on I think he's on one of Kevin's environmental justice groups. And it's just, and then we also have some video testimonials of the youth that are a part of this story map where the children told the stories of why this was really important to them. And they're doing a lot of work in Johnson Creek And they have a partnership with PSU, and they get exposed to all these really smart people like Duran Coles, the person who created this program. And it's just, we were just so excited about giving them a platform as well in this work effort. So I think I'm done. I think that just sums up our presentation. I don't know, Stephanie, if there was another page. I don't think there was another page for this presentation. And I think we're done. And again, Chair George, members of the commission, it's an honor to talk to you today. And thank you very much.
Well, thank you both, Mary Lou and Kevin. And we all will have to be sure and go check out. This looks like a really interesting and exciting way to tell the story of this work that's going on. And I love to see that. I love to see it when we can present information in a way that's really going to engage the public. And we know a good story always does that. So thank you for that. We're really glad that you guys did join us today and update us on this important work. There's a lot of important work going on. And one of the things we're always trying to do is see how these different pieces fit together from different agencies, from different governments, from different administration, state and federal levels. So thank you, Mary Lou and Kevin, both for coming and sharing this vision with us. We are running rather behind. So if we don't have any urgent questions or comments on this, I'll encourage everybody to check out the story map. And Director, if it sounds right, I think we should probably move into our public forum once we thank our guests once again. We got one urgent question here from Commissioner Addington, so we're going to be sure to handle that.
It's urgent. I have to say hello to my friend Mary Lou, who I haven't seen forever. And I knew when I saw this on the agenda, I could count on Mary Lou for some good news. It's so good to see you.
Hi, Greg. It's good to see you. Hugs. In this time of not many hugs, I'm sending you a big hug.
So good to see you.
And I just have to say, Mary Lou's been a tireless champion of bringing resources to important projects like this. So thank you, Mary Lou.
Well, I too can attest to that. And it's wonderful to see good friends and partners. We actually do need that. Commissioner Addington, you're absolutely correct. That actually is urgent today. We've got to recognize that we still have these really important connections that make good work happen with good people. So thank you all for joining us today. It's wonderful to see you both. Okay. So thanks. And Stephanie, we always check in with you as we're coming up on public forum. And you kind of help both remind us and our participants who've been very patiently waiting. We do appreciate your joining us today about how we're going to run this public forum. So Stephanie, go ahead and remind us of how that rolls out.
Thank you, Chair George, commissioners, and meeting attendees. If you are on the Zoom platform, there should be a screen shared that indicates how to get in the speakers queue for public forum. Since not all people are connected that way, I will state it. If you could press the raise hand function or the yes green checkbox, those are both typically found at the bottom of the participants list on Zoom. That will get you into the speakers list. If you are connected by phone, please press *9, and that will actually do the same. It will show up on my screen. I will need just a moment to organize. What we do is we write down the names of the people who have entered in the speakers queue, and then we will go through. So again, please press the raise hand function or the green yes checkbox. That will indicate in Zoom if you'd like to comment. And then if you are on the phone only, please press *9. That will do the same. At this time, Chair George, I have 6 people who are showing on my screen as indicating wanting to comment. We will check back in periodically. And just a note to commenters, we will give you a verbal reminder at the chair's discretion, but approximately 2 minutes and 30 seconds. You have 30 seconds left, and then I will let you know verbally your time is done today. So Chair George, if that works for you, I am ready to unmute our first speaker today, who is Claire Clock.
Wonderful. Just one moment, both Claire and Stephanie. That sounds absolutely great. Again, I'm just going to mention for those folks who are checking in, This is a really important part of our meetings, and one that I think the EQC has really agreed that we want to work on. We definitely want to hear all the concerns from our community, but we also want this to work on ways in which we can make this a little bit more of a dialogue while still being primarily in a taking in information mode. So please just know that that's something we're thinking a lot about and we're going to be working on. I think actually I am going to take Vice Chair Barrasso up on his offer to help with the timekeeping. And Vice Chair Barrasso, what I would ask is that you actually go ahead and just give a 1 minute or warning and go ahead and do it audibly. Speaker, please know that that's not at all intended to be rude or interrupt your comments, but just to let you know that it's time to wrap up your thoughts. And that'll give you a heads up that it's kind of time to wrap up your comments. Also remember that you can always get us additional details via email and reaching out to Stephanie. She always makes sure we get all those materials. So that is another option that's available to you. And we do understand that there could be other folks who will sign up as we get underway. So again, thanks everybody for joining us today. This is a really important part of our meeting, and we get a lot of good, important information and concerns by listening to all of you. So with that, Mr. Clock, we'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, Chair George and members of the commission, Director Whitman, I'm Claire Clock, and I will make email comments as far as the forum. But today I'd like to express my personal gratitude, and that, incidentally, I'm from Clackamas Conservation District, but I'd like to express my personal gratitude for myself and the district for the mega leap that you made yesterday in the drug take back program. The district has worked for decades to encourage landowners and other residents to properly dispose of outdated agriculture and other chemicals and drugs. This is simply a protection of both ground and surface water quality. The second point I have today is Commissioner Kyle's comment yesterday as far as the use of working lands to help mitigate for climate change. The district is always looking to work with other partners and has worked with DEQ in the past to do these types of programs. So it's encouraging that the wider partnership with all the state agencies is taking form. The third thing, final thing is I appreciate Commissioner Kyle's, again, the comment as far as agriculture and forestry interest on the Rules Committee. And I'm talking about not just big ag, but big ag and big timber, but small agriculture and small timber owners. And I do understand Commissioner Mosley's concerned about a large group. He totally has it right. So it's the staff is between a rock and a hard spot on this one, but we really look forward to having this type of input. Thank you for listening, and any questions?
Thank you very much, Mr. Clock. And it's a 1 minute warning. We're
There
not
you go.
seeing any right now. So thank you very much for your thoughts. We appreciate them.
Thank you, Chair George. The next person in our speakers queue is Dale Feek.
Welcome, Mr. Feek.
Thank you, Chair George and Commissioners. I'm Dale Feek, Chair of the Washington County Citizen Action Network and Project Director of Hillsborough Air and Water. A few quick comments. I totally agree with Director Whitman on the greenhouse gas rules. There's been an overemphasis on regulatory community. Consensus will not be possible. It's better not to have consensus and not to try. There needs to be a fairly representing points of view, but you as Environmental Quality Commissioners need to make the tough decisions. I appreciate that. Especially when you take a look at the slide under sector-based greenhouse gas emissions, the projection, it hasn't changed. And it's projected flat line. And if we don't do something very seriously, we are in deep trouble, as evidenced by wildfires, pandemic, and hurricanes. I read the Director Whitman's report fairly in detail. I much appreciate his writing that and then making comments unrelated to it. A few comments about it, though. Concrete environmental product declaration, emphasis in Portland. I want to make sure you also emphasize Hillsborough. Hillsborough is the economic engine of the state, especially Intel, the semiconductor industry, all kinds of construction. Please incorporate Intel in that thing you do. The Sustainable Procurement Initiative, avoiding PFAS. I'm just pleased with the updated toxic list. As you know, I gave all of you the book Exposure by Robert Billett, Poison the Water, Corporate Greed for 20 years. Those PFAS chemicals really need to be controlled. Tear gas in Portland, appreciate Director Whitman's discussing that in the director's report. And also the self-evaluation results of you as commissioners, number 7, 10, and 12, 100%, 100%, 90%. And you do appear to know what your rules are as commissioners. And even though you
1 minute remaining,
sometimes disagree with each other, I'm going to go on to my final stuff. Eric, why I believe Director Richard Whitman and Leah Feldman are the right people for the job. They're both attorneys. Bob Woodworth in the book Rage concluded that Trump is the wrong man on the job. Eric Feely, environmental justice, please, you and the staff get a hold of Catherine Harrington in Washington County. They passed a resolution. They created a staffing on how to deal with that. And so please connect with them so that you get what they've done so far in way of resolution, in the way of equity for low-income homelessness. And they even got PM 2.5 mass for the homeless people. And those are the ones, that needs to be filtered out. And Intel has 14 tons of that, but during this wildfire, they can't put it out by regulation, which I appreciate. So thank you very much for all your work. I appreciate you as competent administrators and DEQ staff is committed to this, to their mission. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fee. Now, our next commenter.
Thank you, Chair George. Our next commenter is Juniper Simonis.
Welcome.
Hello, can you all hear me?
Yes, we hear you great.
All right, thank you so much. My name is Dr. Juniper L. Simonis. I use they, them pronouns. I have a PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology from Cornell University. Lived out here in Portland for 5 years. I'm a Multnomah County resident. I'm the lead scientist and owner of Dapper LLC, a quantitative conservation biology consulting company. And I'm also the founder of the Chemical Weapons Research Consortium. And in particular right now, what I wanted to talk about and highlight and make sure that everyone is aware of is that I've been working with a number of community members and community organizations to do on-the-ground civilian-driven science surrounding chemical weapons use. Now, while I appreciate the mention of the report in the notes earlier from the director's report and a brief mention of tear gas by the previous speaker, I was kind of saddened when I hopped on the phone earlier and we're talking about these unique times and there was no mention of over 100 days of aggressive chemical weapons use by law enforcement against otherwise normal protests. As a very brief and specific take home, I would like to note that the sampling and analysis and conclusions done around the tear gas quote unquote evaluation done by BES at the request of DEQ was wholly insufficient, and it is blatantly disgusting from a scientific perspective that the levels of chromium are not even mentioned. The levels of elevated chromium found in the stormwater system is a pressing environmental concern, point blank.
1 minute.
Other chemicals of severe concern that should be added to the list include current use pesticides, nonniveamide and capsaicin, which are being used to deter mammals, i.e. humans. We also have excessive use of hexachloroethane, a EPA hazardous waste that you all have listed, yet it gets zeros in the evaluation, and I'm not sure why. Perhaps because its use is so restricted here, but it has been aggressively used by federal agents, and it is appalling that it is not even being discussed right now. I am currently working on a manuscript, and I have definitive proof of at least 15 canisters of hexachloroethane smoke, which was listed in 92, and the Army stopped using in 94 and replaced with white phosphorus. I have 15 canisters definitively used by federal agents. So in the area directly above the stormwater drains that go directly into the watershed of the Willamette. And just to wrap this up, I have sampled the Willamette River and have recovered unspent chemical munitions in the river from downtown. I have video evidence, I have photographic evidence. I'm publishing this information now. I will share it with you all, but please, please, please know that the report that you all got is wholly insufficient, and this needs to be much more of a pressing issue immediately to save our environment and our human health. Thank you. Sorry, I'm over time.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing your thoughts to us today. And our next speaker, please.
Thank you, Chair George. Our next speaker is Jonah Sanford.
Welcome.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
We hear you great.
Okay, great. Thanks, Chair George and members of the commission. My name is Jonah Sanford. I'm the staff attorney for the Northwest Environmental Defense Center. I just have a question to pose this morning. What specific regulatory actions has this commission or the agency it oversees taken in the last year that have resulted in actual reductions of diesel particulate emissions in areas found to have existing harmful levels, particularly in neighborhoods where low income and communities of color live, work, learn, and play? Thank you very much for the time.
Great, thank you very much. I know I've certainly made a note of your question, and while there's more work and diesel reduction, diesel particulate matter reduction has been highlighted for next agenda, I think we should take that question on at that time in our agenda item. So thank you. Our next speaker, please.
Thank you, Chair George. Our next speaker is Peggy Harris.
Welcome.
Hello, this is not Peggy Harris. This is Don Simpson. Sorry. Hi, Kathleen. Good to see you, my sister.
Good to see you, Don, or hear
great,
you.
Thanks. I couldn't change the name, but my name is Don Sampson. Members of the commission, I'm a citizen of the Umatilla tribe. I'm the chief of the Walla Wallas. But today I'm here on behalf of the affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians, and we work with tribes across the Pacific Northwest, including the 9 tribes of Oregon. And of course, we're very pleased and honored that Kathleen is chair of this commission and representing not only people across the country, but also a fine delegate representative of tribal nations. So I think it's important that today we're talking about some very important things in terms of the Cap and Reduce Rulemaking Advisory Committee. And we think it's important that the commission understand, and I know I see the work that you're doing. I was just so impressed with the work on the Willamette, the work that we've done to address water quality issues in the state and lead the nation. And now here we are being prepared to take this executive order into action. And we think it's very important that the tribes have an important role in that. We know that Director Whitman is committed to tribal government to government consultations on this. If there was an earlier letter that went out in May, and as you know, Kathleen, that tribes have been slow to respond to that, but we think it's important that that consultation be direct and include them as part of this very important rulemaking process. We think that as we look at the committee composition, I'm concerned that that there are overrepresentation of industry people, and we are now faced with this catastrophic wildfires. But even beyond this, our frontline people, our indigenous people, have been facing climate impacts, whether it be with our traditional foods, the salmon that we harvest at Willamette Falls or up in the headwaters of the Snake River. And we think this is very important that we consider their representation.
1 minute.
And so communities of color, also low-income communities, impacted urban, rural, and coastal communities are on the front line. Now, people across the state are now feeling it. And that is something that is important. The representation is critical. Right now, there's 19 seats. 2 are proposed for tribes. We need more for our tribal nations. 2 are for frontline communities. So 4 to really represent those people who are being impacted on a daily basis. Well, we have 7 seats for utilities and industry that are being affected. That is not equity, and that is not the way that I believe that we should consider this. They have to be represented. Those people that are being impacted on a daily basis need that representation. So I hope you'll consider this, Chair George and members of the commission. We appreciate the work you do. And now is the time that we can make this, take this action forward. I think it's also important to have science, people with science background as well as labor. So thank you for the time, members, and appreciate seeing you again, Kathleen, and look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your thoughts. Thank you for joining us today. And our next speaker, welcome.
Thank you, Chair George. Our next speaker is Zachariah Baker. And to note, we have 2 speakers following after that.
Welcome, Mr. Baker.
Yeah. Thank you. Hi, Chair George and members of the commission. My name is Zach Baker. I'm the Oregon Policy Manager with Climate Solutions. And we're a Northwest-based nonprofit working to accelerate clean energy solutions to the climate crisis. We're also part of Renew Oregon, which is a coalition of a number of organizations that are currently focused on working to implement the executive order. And I am the co-lead, along with Don Sampson, who you just heard from, of the group in the coalition that is working on the cap and reduce effort. And Don and I were some of the many folks who raised the concerns both Director Whitman and Colin shared with you that came up at yesterday's workshop regarding the proposed makeup of the Rulemaking Advisory Committee. And I just want to say I really appreciate them bringing them to you today. And given the importance of the issues, we also submitted a letter last night to you just laying out the concerns, and to reiterate those, as Don had said and eloquently conveyed, that there's a concern that DEQ's proposed Rulemaking Advisory Committee makeup will not ensure an overrepresentation of tribal and impacted community seats. And then there are a couple of other things that raise concerns. There's no mention of seats for labor representatives or individuals with climate science and climate change mitigation experience. Both of those are key voices. Labor, given that they are central to the transition to a clean energy economy, and climate science / climate mitigation expertise, given the main goal of the program is to reduce emissions. So the other thing is that there's no assurance that public interest seats, so environmental and public health representatives, will outnumber industry seats. And given that the cap and reduce program is ultimately about reducing emissions and protecting and benefiting communities with cleaner air and avoiding the worst climate impacts, it's important that the REC reflects those interests. So as we urged DEQ in the workshop yesterday and urged the EQC today, these seats and assurances need to be provided moving forward. Many of the organizations we work with through the Renew Oregon Coalition communicated these same requests and priorities for RAC representation back in June, as DEQ was just beginning its work, and we will continue to push for these throughout the process. Thank you for considering the request, and we look forward to working with you and DEQ to ensure RAC representative of the seats and interests discussed in our letter. Thank you.
Thank you again, Mr. Baker. Welcome to our next commenter.
Our next commenter, Chair George, it shows on my screen is a phone number that ends in 1593.
Welcome.
Yes, hello. My name is Scott Forster.
Hello, we hear you.
Yes, Madam Commissioner and the Commission, thank you for your time today. I just wanted to make a comment on the Director's report regarding 6.1, Chemical Waste Management, Radioactive Waste Disposal Enforcement, Gillum County. One is, I think part of the report should be one of outsiders maybe reading it, being able to understand it just by looking at it. An example would be OWL Inc. Well, OWL Inc. is basically a reference to the, I think, oil field waste logistics, which would be more self-explanatory if that was actually used instead of an acronym of OWL. I thought maybe that was just an oversight until I saw that the lead sentence says that DEQ has been working with the Oregon Department of Energy to investigate illegal disposal of naturally occurring radioactive waste at the Chemical Waste Management Landfill outside Arlington, Oregon. Naturally occurring radioactive waste, well, that's interesting because it is a fracking material related to fracking from, I believe, the Bakken field. So it may be naturally occurring, but it didn't get to Oregon in a naturally occurring way. And frankly, that's an underplaying of the seriousness of this issue. Also, and I'm not sure what would be the mission or the purpose of underplaying something that is relatively serious. The idea that we had basically, 2.5 million pounds of radioactive waste disposed, apparently ostensibly radium, but that doesn't include the possibility of radon, thorium, and uranium all being radioactive. I don't know if that's been tested. Apparently, Oregon standards are 5 picocuries per gram for radium-226 and 20 picocuries per gram of 228. It says the concentrations are up to 1,700 picocuries per gram, and there were 2.5 million pounds. I think it's responsible to let Oregon citizens know not only of this great enforcement action, but also the fact that in a public report to not mention by full name the corporations that are responsible, like OWL, Oilfield Waste Logistics, and also the fact that there may be need for additional testing, and to kind of underplay what is a huge issue here in terms of this violation by Chemical Waste Management, which has had violations in the past. So just kind of you say you're wanting to pay attention to the citizen part of your process. My suggestion in closing would be that you actually have occasionally a meeting, maybe once every quarter or once every 6 months, where it's just open for everything. Just publicly put it out there among all folks out there and say, anything environmental, bring it up, and we'll just, take the information and do what we can and then follow up later.
Thank you very much for joining us and sharing your thoughts today.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
And thank you, Chair George. This is Stephanie Caldera, your Commission Assistant. The last person I have signed up to comment today is Nora Apter.
Oh, thank you, Chair George and members of the Commission. Again, my name is Nora Apter, and I'm the Climate Program Director for the Oregon Environmental Council, or OEC. We're a nonprofit organization that works to advance innovative, collaborative, and equitable solutions to Oregon's environmental challenges. And I would just like to echo some of the previous comments on the question of item H, the representation on the Cap and Reduce Rulemaking Advisory Committee. And first off, I do really want to just echo the thanks and appreciation for all of DEQ's incredible work on EO 2004 implementation overall, but especially all of the work that DEQ staff has put into the technical workshops for the Cap and Reduce program design over the past several weeks. I had the opportunity to attend all 6 workshops, and one theme that seemed to come up again and again in the workshop conversations was the need to ensure that the Cap and Reduce program incorporate and prioritize the needs and interests of tribes and communities of color and other impacted communities who are not only experiencing the impacts of climate change first and worst, but also have been historically underrepresented in decision making. So just again, to echo some of what you've already heard, we really want to ensure that we maximize the opportunity for those voices and perspectives to be heard and incorporated into the program design. And so OEC would strongly urge that the RAC make up be adjusted to ensure that there's an overrepresentation of the tribal and impacted community seats on the RAC. I'll also reiterate the request to include seats for labor representatives as well as seats for individuals with climate science expertise, which are both critical perspectives to be included
1 minute remaining
in the rulemaking process, and would just finally underscore that the Cap and Reduce program is ultimately about reducing emissions and protecting and benefiting communities. So again, would just please ask that the RAC include an overrepresentation of public interest representatives. Thank you so much again for the opportunity to weigh in and for your consideration, and we're really looking forward to continuing to work with you all.
Thank you, Nora, for joining us today and sharing your thoughts with us. Stephanie, is that still our last commenter?
Chair George, this is Stephanie Caldera, the EQC assistant. I have no other raised hands or other indications that people wish to present comment for public forum today.
Okay. Well, commissioners, is there anything that you'd like to share in response to what you've heard at this time? Or are you just, taking notes and thinking about what you've heard? I just wanted to provide that opportunity. I don't know, I find that I always need to kind of reflect on what I've heard and look over my notes a little bit. So sometimes putting somebody on the spot immediately isn't where the best dialogue happens. It happens after we've had an opportunity to think things over. Commissioner Kyle.
Thanks, Kathleen. First, I just want to apologize for getting dropped off the call. We actually have heavy rain and a little bit of lightning down here in Corvallis. So I hope that's moving where it needs to move. I just want to remark that I appreciate the public forum. I like hearing the voices and the concerns of the community. I agree it takes a little bit of time to absorb the information. And I do echo your statements that I think we need to work on how we can improve public forum. But in the meantime, I do want to reassure the people that have taken the time to comment that we do listen to what you have to say, and it does get incorporated into the operations.
Thank you, Commissioner Kyle. It does, and it also, there's a lot of follow-up questions that happen on offline, right after we've had time to reflect. One of the ideas that, Vice Chair Barrasso and Richard and I have talked about is, because of course, the nature of the public input is that people are gonna bring up whatever they're bringing to the table that day. We might not have perfect information, if we kind of engage in a little bit more dialogue. But we just need to undertake it with that understanding. The right staff who can speak to that issue may not be present on the call, but I think we can undertake a desire to have a little bit more dialogue in a good faith way, with the understanding that there are times when we'll need to do more complete research or follow up later. But I think it's just important to share that it's something that we're all thinking about and something that's important to all of us. All right. Well, thank you again, everybody who's joined us today, our commenters, our presenters. We've had some really good information and some really good updates. We've also identified some follow-ups for our next agenda and future work. Looking at our schedule, I'm just going to note that we were scheduled to adjourn and then to follow up with an executive session according to our posted agenda here. But before we do that, Vice Chair Barrasso.
Thank you. I should have said this earlier, and I just, the one thing I wonder, and it's a question for staff, is as we've shifted to this remote format for all the reasons that we've had to shift to this format, I do wonder, and it's a question of staff, at some point it would be worth just placing a survey potentially at the end of one of our commission meetings or at the thing, just for people to see, I'd love to know whether this has made the meetings more accessible. Previously, when we met in person, our public comment periods have required people to show up in person. Yes, they could call, but at least calling is different than seeing people in video. And so that's something that I'd love to know for folks, because that may be something that we may want to hold on to as we eventually, I hope, return back to meeting in person. That's all I had.
That's a really great and valuable question. Director.
Yes, thank you, Chair George and Vice Chair Barrasso. Just, I want to clarify so I make sure we're responsive to your suggestion. Were you suggesting a survey of participants in the meeting about how to make the meetings more effective in terms of engagement, or?
You'll have to think more broadly about it. It was just acknowledgement. I've done this in meetings where at the end of a meeting, I'll put up a link that says, how did this meeting work? And I'll have a few questions there that's like, was this actually more accessible than other meetings? So I'm sure you may want to include other questions in there. But it's just, I know we hadn't done this. We talked about including video access before, and our previous access to commenting has really been dialing in, which just limits the way people engage because they don't see you in terms of other than showing up in person.
Okay, we have we're doing lots of virtual, we're all doing lots of virtual meetings now, and in some of the public virtual meetings, we have been using the survey tool. I think it's an interesting idea. We'll think about how to use that maybe in a variety of ways is another tool to help.
Yeah, well, and one artifact of the nature of the technology is you can count how many folks have joined over the course of a meeting. Now, those numbers might not always be perfect because, it's possible, I guess, for a person to join on two different lines. But generally speaking, I mean, you can get a pretty good indicator of how many people have joined the meeting, at least at some point, to listen, participate, or ask a question. I think our general in-person meetings, certainly people who wish to address the commission sign up, but I don't know if we have any sort of, record of how many people who aren't DEQ staff who attend those meetings. And yet it would be interesting, for example, to see what were the number of participants in these Zoom style EQC meetings we've had recently. Those of us who just go to a lot of them would also have a sense of, does that look like significantly more people than we get on an average meeting or not? I would say typically our Portland meetings and Portland area meetings are the most highly attended. That's not all that surprising. But it would be interesting to just look at those numbers and see what they're looking like. I know that most of the time I'm working in a small rural tribal community, and we've seen our participation in meetings really go up substantially with the electronic option. So I think these are just valuable things for us to think about. All right. Thanks, anyone. Anybody else? Before we adjourn and take a quick break before going to executive session, do we have anything else? For the good of the order? All right, seeing none, I will entertain a motion to adjourn with the understanding that the EQC will, as scheduled, be going into an executive session approximately 10 minutes after we adjourn. I'll entertain a motion.
So moved.
Do we have a second?
Seconded.
Anybody opposed to adjourning at this time? Hearing none, we are adjourned at 12:34. Let's come back at 12:45 for our executive session.
Chair George, this is Stephanie Caldera, your commission assistant. Just to note for the record, the executive session is held under a different link per the terms of confidentiality. That has been emailed to the commissioners and staff. However, if any commissioners and staff have not received that email, I'm available by email or my telephone in this time to relay that information to you.
All right, very good.
Stephanie, real quick, I think DEQ email has been down for me. So if any chance you can, I may just text you and follow up.
Yes, Vice Chair, I can provide it another way. Thank you.
All right. Thanks very much, everyone. Everyone stay well and safe out there. And the very best to everyone. Thank you again. Goodbye.